You wake into a palace morning the way flour wakes under a cloth, slowly, evenly, with no need to hurry. You are not a guest here, just a careful observer, moving along the service corridors of the Hofburg when the light is still a suggestion, and the city has not yet rung the hour. The air is cool, even in summer, because masonry remembers night. Somewhere below, water is coming to a measured simmer, and above you a door closes without malice, the latch answering the hand that knows it. If you wish to understand the Habsburg court, you begin not with politics, but with routine. Breakfast in this world is not a scene, but a schedule. The imperial household runs by habit and written lists. Who rises when? Who serves whom? Which tray goes to which antechamber? What goes on the tray? The pastry that anchors these mornings looks unassuming. A crescent roll, glazed with nothing, maybe brushed with a little milk before baking, sometimes seeded with caraway if the day allows, more often plain. It is called the Kipferl, and it sits at the quiet centre of the court's first meal, as firmly as the ink sits in the Chancellor's well. You encounter it first as dough. The night staff has scaled the ingredients earlier, because the practice of scaling, of measuring by weight, not by guess, belongs to bakers as prayer belongs to monks. For a basic Kipferl dough in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the rhythm is simple: wheat flour, warmed milk, a little yeast, salt and butter. Sometimes a touch of sugar, which in these decades is becoming less of a luxury and more of a staple, thanks to the empire's growing beet sugar industry. Before beet, there was cane, expensive and shipped. After beet, there is a steadier sweetness, pale and local, good for everyday cakes and the modest enrichment of breakfast bread. The flour here is not random. Court suppliers know the difference between a winter wheat that drinks more water and makes a stronger structure, and a softer wheat that gives tenderness but sulks under strain. The best Kipferl do not flake, like a puff pastry. They pull, like a quiet conversation, elastic even, unshowy. The baker leans on a wooden bench polished by predecessors he never met. His hands do not knead in the dramatic sense. He folds, waits, and folds again, because time and temperature do more than muscle. On another bench, a cloth, linen, always linen, rests over a bowl. You lift the cloth as if lifting a sentence mid-thought. The dough has become something else while you were looking away. You might ask about origins, because pastry invites stories the way bread invites hands. There is a legend, often repeated for tourists, and for those who prefer a neat anecdote to the slower conversation of sources, which claims the crescent shape commemorates the moons on Ottoman flags after the siege of Vienna in 1683. A brave baker hears tunnelling, an alarm is raised, the city is saved, and a pastry is shaped like the enemy's emblem so that citizens can bite victory each morning. It is neat. It is satisfying. It is also, as most neat stories are, uncertain. Crescent breads exist in earlier records across Central Europe. Monastic kitchens baked curved loaves on feast days, sometimes sweetened, sometimes not. In trade inventories you find crescents listed alongside pretzels and small buns, and the word Kipferl itself bends linguistically the way the dough does physically, suggesting little horn or crook. The court does not need a myth to eat. It needs a reliable roll that pairs with coffee, butter and jam, and fits well on porcelain. This is a court of lists, and lists make habits honest. The pastry room keeps its own. How many dozen for the emperor, the empress, archduchesses, visiting relatives of complicated rank? How many for the outer offices, because even clerks must eat? Coffee is measured too, roasted and ground by those who know the difference between yesterday's beans and today's. The Kipferl is small enough to be eaten politely, and large enough to carry you to the next duty. It is also forgiving. If you cannot finish it at once, it waits without complaint, a lesson in civility disguised as bread. Observe the shaping. After the first rise, the dough is divided into portions weighed by a scale that has seen more dawns than many of its users. Each piece is rolled into a slender triangle, thicker at the base, thinner at the tip. Butter is present but discreet. This is not a croissant, which in later French technique will laminate butter between layers. The Kipferl expresses modesty and fat, enough to enrich, not enough to boast. The baker rolls the triangle from base to tip, bends it into a crescent, and sets it on the peel with the point tucked underneath so the roll does not open as it rises. The crescent is not decoration. It is an old shape that nests well in baskets, that echoes the curve of a cupped hand. If eggs are available and desired, a light wash adds colour. If not, milk will do. Some kitchens brush with nothing at all, preferring the pale tan of a baked wheat that has kept its own counsel. You might think this is only a matter of taste, but here palate is tied to supply, and supply to empire. Butter, for example, is not simply there in the kitchen. It travels from dairy farms that lie within distances made coherent by the imperial road system. Its quality changes with season. Fresh grass in spring lends a scent to fat that winter cannot offer. The kitchens take note, and so do the diners, even if they would not put it into words. The morning kipferl, you will find, tastes different in June than in January, and this is not a failure of standardization but the record of a land speaking through food. Then there is yeast. The court uses both balm from brewing and compressed yeast as it becomes available through the 19th century. The difference is practical, not romantic. Balm can be uneven. Compressed yeast brings predictability. Predictability is a virtue when you bake for hundreds before sunrise. The first batches go in while the palace is quiet. You can hear the oven more than see it, because doors are heavy and open only as needed. The baker's timing is a choreography you do not applaud. Load, turn, unload, repeat. The smell is not yet sweet. It is cereal and warm stone, the smell of work well begun. While the kipferl bakes, consider the table you will not see. A small tray, not the public buffet of later cafes, arranged for a person who eats in a measured way. Silver stands hold thin pots of apricot preserve from the imperial estates. The jam is not boiled hard to a candy. Its gel is soft, a matter of fruit and patience. Butter comes on a cold plate, cut into dominoes that make sense to the hand. A small dish of salt sits where salt always sits. Coffee arrives in porcelain that remembers heat graciously and cools it at an honest pace. The cup's handle is not a loop for the finger, but a handle for the mind. You hold it in a specific way because others before you did, and that is the quiet significance of etiquette. The kipferl meets knife, and preserve the way paper meets ink. You cut it open without drama, because flaking is not the point. The interior is a fine, even crumb, that accepts butter without greed. Apricot is a preferred partner, not because fashion said so, but because the empire grew good apricots, particularly in the Wachau, where sun and river make a fruit that needs only sugar and time. If there is honey, it is local. If there is cheese, it is fresh and white and unsalted to be salted at the table. You can, of course, eat the kipferl plain. Many do. In that case, you will notice the pleasure of restraint. Wheat, milk, a trace of sweetness, a breath of yeast. It is a bread roll that answers the morning without trying to complete it. There is a temptation to think of court food as drama. Tall centerpieces, sugar palaces, marzipan swans. But breakfast does not perform, it sustains. In the notebooks of stewards you find fewer adjectives and more numbers. Deliveries counted, rations assigned, prices updated. That is in truth more interesting than spectacle, because it shows you the machinery by which a day acquires shape. A kipferl is not invented every morning, it is repeated. Repetition is the court's art form, and the baker its quiet practitioner. What of health? The 19th century is curious about digestion, and the court is no exception. Physicians recommend moderation, warm liquids, and breads that do not sit heavily. The kipferl qualifies. It is leavened, not dense. It is small, not excessive. If someone asks for more, it can be given without ceremony. If someone refuses, the roll returns to the basket and will find another plate. Kitchens dislike waste, not from frugality alone, but from habit formed when ingredients cost labour more than coin. Cream skimmed, flour sifted, fuel fetched and accounted for, even in palaces. Efficiency is not vulgar. It is ordinary. You might want to compare the kipferl to later croissants with their laminated layers and shattering crusts. The comparison is useful only if you allow each to be itself. The kipferl is earlier, steadier, rooted in the home and the bakery rather than in the grand patisserie. It belongs to the empire's practical mornings. When, later, the French croissant takes Europe by appetite, flaky, buttery, theatrical, the kipferl continues beside it, unbothered. In many households you will find both, as different tools for different jobs. Coffee speaks a slightly louder language to the croissant. Tea often prefers the kipferl's softer consonants. Trace, if you like, the staff who make this role possible. grain merchants who negotiate harvests against weather, millers who understand stones and bolting cloth, dairy workers who churn before dawn, carters who learn the palace gates and guards by first name, woodmen and coal merchants who heat ovens, apprentices who sweep flour the way an archivist dusts a manuscript, journeyman bakers who walk from town to town collecting techniques the way a priest collects stories, stewards who sign for deliveries with the same pen they will use for reprimands and holiday lists. Every bite of a kipfurl is a map and a ledger, and the court eats both. Now attend to the oven's door as it opens. Heat comes out not as a wave, but as a statement. The rolls are pale gold, the thin tips slightly darker, the undersides evenly set. A wooden peel slides them to a basket lined with a cloth that keeps them warm and allows them to breathe. You lift one, not to eat, but to listen. A good roll murmurs at first, tiny sounds of steam making peace with cooler air. It is not poetry, though it sounds like it. It is physics obliged to patience. There are variations. On certain feast days, the kipfel may be sprinkled with a few poppy seeds, because poppy is abundant in the regions that send grain to Vienna, and the court appreciates patterns that honour supply. On days of fasting in older calendars, the dough might lean more on oil than on butter, or be taken smaller, to respect rules that marry appetite to discipline. In winter, when butter is firmer and milk sweeter, the crumb tightens. In summer, it opens. The roll tells the date without a calendar if you listen long enough. Beyond the private rooms, the palace offices receive their own trays. Clerks eat at desks, standing or seated, depending on the variety of their day. The document absorbs a smear of apricot that will dry into amber by afternoon. No one records it. Not all history is in the archives. Much of it is in crumbs brushed carefully to the floor, so that mice are not encouraged and stewards are not displeased. The kipfel leaves the palace too. Households of mid-level officials mimic court breakfasts in modest ways, buying rolls from licensed bakers who hang their guild signs with quiet pride. The roll becomes a civilian habit, then a city identity. When cafes spread, some patronised by courtiers, some by the people who serve them, bread and coffee meet without chaperones. But the court retains the manner of its mornings, not because it resists change, but because some routines deserve keeping. A palace can learn new steps without discarding the old. You may think at this point that nothing surprising has happened. That is the point. The kipfel's history is not a parade of inventions, it is the steady practice of a form. The lost recipe here is not a vanished list of ingredients, but a vanished context. The timing, the hands, the supply lines, the expectations that made a roll taste the way it did. To approach it now is to reconstruct not merely proportions, but habits. How long to wait after mixing, how warm a room should feel under the wrist, how a bench should sound under a knife, how a basket should be lined and covered. You cannot bottle those details, but you can learn to notice them. That noticing is the work. If you wish to make such a roll today, you would begin with flour of modest strength and a mind disposed to patience. You would temper your milk to warm, not hot. Dissolve yeast without anxiety. Salt as if you trust salt to be itself. Add butter that still remembers the cow. You would knead only until the dough agrees, then rest, then shape. You would bake hotter than you expect and shorter than you fear, because colour can mislead and crumb cannot be rushed. You would eat it quietly, with a preserve that tells you what your land grows best. In doing so, you would not imitate a palace. You would imitate attention. And so, when you sit with the kipfel and the coffee and the early light, you are not reenacting a legend. You are practicing an order. The day, once again, has been started by people whose names you will not learn. Their labour is in your hand, and in the roll, and in the quiet of a room you do not need to describe. You take a bite. You taste wheat, milk, thyme, and the hand that folded the dough. You wonder, as many have, whether such ordinary things can bear the weight of history. Perhaps they already do, silently, patiently each morning, until someone asks the right question. What then did a single crescent on a porcelain plate mean to those who ate it? Not as a story, but as a habit they trusted more than any tale. You move from the warm hush of the bakery to the colder arithmetic that keeps it alive. Section by section, the palace reveals not romance but method. Ledgers, guild stamps, seals in red wax, and the steady beat of deliveries that turn grain into habit. If section 1 showed you the roll itself, the feel of dough, the honest gold of the crust, Now you follow the threads that let a crescent appear on porcelain precisely when it should. The Kipferl is not a miracle, it is a system. Start with flour. You hold in mind that not all wheat is equal, not even within the same season. Court contracts name suppliers in a ring around. Vienna, because redundancy is stability. A late rain in one valley should not interrupt breakfast. Millers agree to standards expressed in practical terms. How fine the bolting cloth, how white the flour, how much bran may remain. The court stewards record test bakes. They do not use adjectives, they use results. Rises true, keeps 2 hours, no bitterness, good crumb. In this language, a loaf earns trust or loses it. You notice, reading these notes in your mind, how the Kipferl's modest size fits the variables. A smaller roll forgives small changes in protein or moisture. It hides the weather's uneven hand in a structure that prefers patience. Now consider yeast. Brewing balm comes from imperial breweries tied to the household. Later, compressed yeast arrives from entrepreneurial chemists and bakers who learn to cultivate a more reliable strain. The palace does not change on a whim. It changes with trials, side by side. You imagine a winter week when 2 batches of Kipferl go to 2 antechambers, one from balm, one from compressed yeast. The clerk's note is simple. The second rises with less variance. That phrase is a policy. When your obligation is to feed the same mouth at the same hour every day, variance is the enemy. You taste both rolls and find little difference, but the schedule tastes the difference for you. The court adopts compressed yeast for critical mornings while keeping balm for secondary bakes. Tradition bends, does not break. Sugar is a quiet revolution, not a flavour alone. In earlier centuries, cane sugar travelled far. Its cost and distance made sweetness an event. When the empire's beet sugar industry matures, sweetness becomes domestic. You might see this as a culinary note. The stewards see it as an accounting line. Apricot preserve can be made in larger volumes and kept with more certainty. Glazes become less precious. A spoon of sugar and scalded milk for a child is no longer a special kindness but a routine. The Kipferl, which asks for only a little sugar in the dough or none at all, inhabits this change by implication. It is paired with a world that now has sweet things at hand. Jam thickens not by boiling to death, but by patient reduction, because sugar is steady and fuel is dear. Fuel is the unglamorous master. The ovens that bake the Kipferl consume wood, and later, coal. Each form carries its own timing and heat character. Hardwood fires establish a radiant bed. Coal burns longer, hotter, slower to forgive. The baker learns, not by thermometer at first, but by colour and ear. The pale skin of a proving roll is ready when it shivers slightly under a fingertip, the oven ready when it hums, the sound of heat meeting stone. You think about how often this meeting happens, every morning across years, and realise that lost recipes are rarely lost measurements. They are lost relationships between a hand, a room, and a fire. To replicate, you do not only write, you rehearse. From fuel you walk to water. Kitchen cisterns store it cool. Kettles bring it to the precise warmth that keeps yeast awake but unstartled. The carter who delivers water from the city supply is paid by volume and by reliability. Heavy snow, frozen streets. The Kipferl does not excuse itself on account of weather. You picture a winter morning when the kettle is late. The senior baker adjusts. He folds time. A little less proof here, a little warmer bench there, a few moments delay in loading. In the record, nothing changes. On the tongue, nothing changes. The work changed. That is craft, the calm solving of unrecorded problems. Now step past kitchens into guilds. The Aufzuckerbäcker, the court confectioners, have privileges and duties, and though Kipferl belong more to bakers than to confectioners, the worlds are neighbours. Guild rules protect titles and require apprenticeships that last years. A boy who sweeps flour becomes a man who shapes dough. He earns the right to wear a journeyman's piece of metal stitched to his jacket. He travels, works, collects techniques. When he returns and attempts to become a master, he must present a work that proves he can feed not only a palate but an order. The Kipferl is simple. That is why it is a test. It does not hide errors. A master's bench is polished by humility. The palace is a city within a city, and delivery is choreography. Baskets of rolls travel by narrow stairs so that public corridors remain decorous. Footmen learn to carry warmth without steam ruining the crisping surface. The cloths that line baskets are washed to a rhythm that does not permit lint. Its fibres would cling to the crust and dishonour a mouth. The maid who launders these cloths is part of the recipe, though no cookbook names her. You practice a kind of respect by noticing her work. Coffee shares the morning with bread, and coffee's story passes through the port of Trieste, and the merchants who understood wind, debt and news. Beans arrive green. Roasting happens close to service for reasons of aroma that became cultural law. The court's roaster adjusts by ear as much as by eye. Beans crack, release moisture, darken. He stops short of bitterness because the Kipferl is mild and does not argue. A bitter brew would make the roll taste timid. Instead, the two agree. Warm wheat and warm coffee, neither showman, both reliable. Etiquette is an instrument of digestion. Physicians advise against heavy meats at breakfast and against arguments. Letters may be read. Political matters may be deferred until the second coffee. The Kipferl supports this. It is a food that grants space to thought. When you address the listener directly, you choose butter, you reach for apricot, you break the roll with a quiet sigh, you also invite them into a behaviour, patient eating, patient thinking. The palace trains through pastry. That is not fanciful, it is practical pedagogy. You want dates, and though this is a sleeping history, you deserve anchors. Across the long 19th century, Vienna's urban expansion and imperial logistics tighten. Road improvements and railway lines collapse distance. With them, time tightens too. Conversations about breakfast can seem modest beside wars and congresses, but the habit of a secure morning enters the bones of a bureaucracy. The stewards who rely on a certain hour for food rely on a certain hour for letters. The calendar becomes granulated into dependable units. A Kipferl at 7 carries invisibly, a memorandum at 9 and an audience at 11. You do not exaggerate when you say that bread helps to schedule an empire. There are seasons beyond weather, liturgical seasons. Fasting days shape pastry. On some mornings, butter is omitted or reduced, replaced by oil. The roll is smaller. The choice is not aesthetic. It is obedience to a calendar that trained populations before clocks did. The kitchen skill includes this flexibility. The Kipferl must be itself in plenty and in restraint. You taste the difference with your eyes closed. The leaner crumb, the cleaner scent. Even the knife moves differently through it. In those moments you learn that simplicity is not one thing, it has many registers. What about plateware? Porcelain matters because heat does. A thicker plate steals warmth from the roll. A thinner plate returns it too quickly. The court's porcelain factories know this and calibrate. Handles fit the hand at angles learned over generations. The saucer's lip prevents a spoon from trespassing on linen. A small detail. Butter is delivered in blocks shaped to the knife's natural sweep so that a single gesture yields the right amount. Each tiny convenience saves seconds. Thousands of seconds per week are hours. Hours reorganize labour. The Kipferl's very shape, curved, easy to pick up and set down without scattering, belongs to this arithmetic of grace. Supply lines include people you rarely imagine. Orchard keepers in Wachau tending apricot trees to yield preserves that taste like early summer even in January. Cooperers who make barrels that do not leak because leaking is failure written in sticky footprints. Glassmakers who blow jars that can survive a water bath's embrace without cracking. Carters who pad crates with straw so that pots arrive unshattered. Scribes who index the stores carefully enough that an assistant can find apricot last year. Upper shelf, left. You picture the pantry as a library of sweetness, labelled in a hand steady from habit. A palace is a hive. The Kipferl is the bee's plain bread. Adulteration exists and guardrails against it. Cinnamon may be dusted with cheap fillers. Flour may be improved with chalk in disreputable corners of a city. Butter may carry too much water if a dairyman is careless. The court employs tasters and inspectors who know how deceit tastes and feels. A pinch of flour rubbed between fingers reveals grit. A bit of butter melted in a spoon tells whether water pops too loudly. The punishments are economic. A supplier loses his contract. The steady coin goes elsewhere. Honesty is rewarded not by speeches but by continued work. The Kipferl, by showing up, is a certificate of character for dozens of hands. When you think of lost pastry recipes, you perhaps imagine ingredients no longer available. Sometimes that is true. Vanillas change with climate and trade, almonds with varietal preference. But more often what disappears is patience. In the court kitchen, patience is the capital, not the garnish. A roll that proves 10 minutes too long may not collapse, but it will dry early. The baker knows by touch when the dough returns a certain softness to his finger. He does not time alone, he listens. You can learn this today if you choose to. You can make your own patience a tool. Turn to the tray. It is assembled according to precedence that seems fussy, until you realise it removes friction from the day. The person who eats should not look for salt. It should be where salt always is. The preserve spoon should not drip. Its notch keeps it still. The bread knife should not tear. It is sharpened at intervals fixed not by whim, but by schedule. When everything is where it always is, attention is freed for matters that change. Routine is not tyranny here, it is mercy. You think of cafes because Viennese mornings migrate from palace to city and back again. In a cafe, the kipferl meets more public eyes. Newspapers unfold, spoons chime, sugar cubes clink. The roll that was a court habit becomes a civic one. It acquires companions, butterhorns, small cakes, pretzels, yet keeps its identity by understatement. Tourists may seek the myth of 1683. Locals practice the comfort of 6:30. You sit among them, not fully awake, full of a trust that your city keeps ordinary promises. The kipferl is one such promise. Training an apprentice in this world is an education in restraint. He learns to sweep flour so it does not rise into lungs, to carry a peel so it does not singe a sleeve, to lift a cloth without disturbing the proof, to judge when a bench is too warm for shaping, to leave rolls a finger width apart so they kiss in the oven but do not embrace. None of these lessons feel like poetry. All of them taste like it. By the time he's allowed to shape kipferl for the emperor's tray, he has already learned that excellence is often anonymous. There are errors. A batch goes flat, a delivery is late. A new maid stacks cloths too tight, and they dry with a smell that the roll does not forgive. Corrections follow without drama. The steward notes the cause, amends the process, and moves on. No one writes a treatise. The next day's kipferl is fine. You file that away as a form of wisdom. Systems that support mornings also support apologies. In the corner of the pastry room stands a scale with little brass weights nested in each other like a family. On one weight someone has scratched a date with a pin. You imagine indulgently that it marks a day when an apprentice became a journeyman, or a morning when the first compressed yeast dough proved in this room, or a birthday remembered during a lull. History hides in such scratches, not only in proclamations. When you bake a roll today, you inherit that scratch, whether you know it or not. Finally, return to the plate. A kipferl that has cooled past ideal is not a failure. It is a different bread. It prefers butter more at that point. It welcomes dipping into coffee. The court allows this adaptability. Not every moment is perfect. Many are sufficient. The palace is not a theatre at breakfast. It is a workshop of contentment. You let that sink in. You feel the roll reduce your hunger without waking your ambition too quickly. The day will come, and it will be organised. Bread is how you begin to trust that. You close section 2 with one more thread. Travel. When members of the imperial family move, from Vienna to Schönbrunn, from palace to spa town, the kipferl travels with them. Recipes are noted, ovens in other kitchens are measured. The baker adjusts a draught and altitude and wood of a different cut. If the roll tastes a little of smoke in a country house, no one protests. They note the variation. The routine flexes, but it does not fracture. You understand then that the identity of a thing is not a fixed point but a corridor of acceptable differences within which life proceeds smoothly. So when you next break a crescent, you handle more than dough. You handle the sum of fields, benches, fires, roots, calendars, guilds, and small acts of respect that keep mornings merciful. The kipferl is not loud about this. It does not need to be. By being expected and then present, it teaches you what a society values without saying a word. If the meaning of a court is partly the promise that small important things will happen on time, what happens to meaning when the small thing fails? Does the day bend to repair it, or does the person do so quietly, with butter and patience? And who learns the lesson either way? You return to the bench where the morning began and sit with the finished roll, not as a curiosity now, but as a conclusion. A court's pastry can end in spectacle: spun sugar, moulded creatures, architectural flourishes, but the kipferl concludes by repeating itself. This is its quiet climax, not a twist, not an explosion of novelty, but the confirmation that today's roll tastes like yesterday's and will taste like tomorrow's. In a palatial world that is always negotiating change, marriages, treaties, births, illnesses, retirements, the small constancy of breakfast is the point. The story ends by keeping its promise. To close the circle, you follow the roll beyond the palace threshold and along the broader arc of the century. The city grows around this bread. Streets push outward, apartments stack taller, rail lines knit hinterlands to the capital, and shops absorb country habits into urban rhythms. Bakers open earlier, cafes stay open, later, and the kipfel moves through both, unbothered by scale. You can track a social change by watching where a roll is eaten. First at a tray in a quiet room, later at a marble-topped table among newspapers, later still in a standing bakery where hands exchange coins for a paper bag, and the day begins in motion. Constancy adapts. That is how it survives. You collect the paper traces that memorialise a simple thing. Household manuals, steward notebooks, and printed cookbooks write the kipfel down in lines that are at once practical and respectful. Flour measured by weight, milk warmed to the temperature of blood, yeast dissolved without haste, salt added last so as not to startle the leaven. Some writers include a spoon of sugar when available, others omit it entirely, and many mark a preference not with superlatives but with verbs: fold, prove, shape, tuck, bake. You notice how few adjectives you need to get something right. In that economy of language you glimpse the economy of the kitchen. No flourish that isn't earned, no step that isn't anchored by reason. Printed recipes do not fully replace apprenticeship. They live alongside it, as reminders and as starting points. You picture a young baker reading a new edition by tallow light, and then turning to face the old oven with its older lessons. His fingers know what the page does not say. How a damp morning asks him to dust the bench a little more, how a tired flower drinks differently than a proud one, how to slide a peel so the rolls do not jolt. The book and the bench become a matched pair, memory in type and memory in muscle. The kipfel's ending is the agreement between the two. There are interruptions. The century brings poor harvests and bureaucratic corrections. It brings eventually shortages and ration cards, when sugar retreats again to the realm of careful use, when butter thins or disappears, when the roll leans into oil and patience. You open the pantry ledger and see the substitutions written in a hand that does not dramatise deprivation. It records it. Breakfast continues, leaner and smaller. The kipfel keeps its shape even as its crumb changes. You're reminded that resilience is not a grand gesture, but a series of small ones. The roll still rises, the coffee still warms, the routine still holds as far as it can. When supply lines recover, the recipe expands back toward its old self. Not instantly, not perfectly, but recognisably. Continuity is not the absence of breaks. It is the art of mending them quietly. You attend too to the people who end their working lives with this bread. A master baker steps away from the bench he polished with his forearms and leaves a groove for the next person. An imperial steward retires, and the new steward copies the old lists rather than rewriting them, understanding that lists carry culture the way yeast carries breath. The maid who laundered basket cloths trains a younger neighbour to handle linen without, wrenching it to shake it in air that smells faintly of coal and damp stone, to fold it warm so that it remembers the basket's curve. These exits and entrances do not make a headline, they make a morning. The kipfel is their handshake. Because ends invite comparisons, you allow yourself to set the kipfel beside its more boastful cousins. Laminated pastries that crackle and scatter steal attention in modern cases. They are excellent at what they do. They make you look. The kipfel does not insist on your gaze. It inhabits your hand and disappears efficiently. If you judge only by spectacle, another pastry wins. If you judge by service, how a food supports thought, conversation and pace, the kipfel holds its ground. In closing, this is the roll's defence. Usefulness made pleasing, not performance made edible. You consider the table once more as a machine. Everything on it is designed to reduce friction. The knife edge is maintained so that cutting does not require effort that would wake the mind too quickly. The preserve is set softly enough to spread without tearing. The butter sits where the wrist expects it. The porcelain cools at a rate that spares the tongue and preserves warmth for measured sips. This choreography is not trivial. It allows someone else's morning, your morning, to align without waste. The Kipfel's end is not in the last bite. It is in the hour it gives you afterward, organised and calm. What does the court learn from this food? That taste is more than flavour. It is judgment across systems. You align supply contracts to climate, you pair orchard with kettle, you match oven with fuel, you place a roll beside a cup at a minute learned over years. The palace's obvious duties to write, to receive, to deliberate depend on this less obvious duty, to make small things right on time. The Kipferl is the habit that trains the larger habit. Endings are revealed in what continues. If you want the most practical closure, you could copy a recipe in today's terms and declare the problem solved. You could write down ratios easily enough. Parts flour to parts liquid, a percentage of fat, a pinch of salt, a hint of sugar if it is a day for sweetness. But the point of a lost recipe is seldom that no one knows the numbers. It is that few remember the relation of numbers to rooms and hands. So your conclusion offers a different kind of instruction, one you can carry beyond pastry. Warm your ingredients to the room and warm the room to the work. Choose steadiness over speed. A dough that proves a little cooler and a little longer forgives more. Place tools where they remove thought rather than demand it. Attend to fuel because heat is a language and learn to hear it. Let repetition be a teacher instead of a boredom. Remember that food is also a schedule. By keeping it, you keep yourself. You hold the baked roll and think about the meanings people attach to its shape. Legends reach for battles and emblems. Commerce reaches for price. Households reach for comfort. Guilds reach for ranks. Physicians reach for moderation. The Kipfel answers all of them softly. You may read me how you like, but I serve a simpler thing, beginning a day with something modest, warm, and placed where it should be. Sometimes ends arrive with trumpets, sometimes they arrive with a basket and a folded cloth. You trace a last practical ripple. A child of a clerk grows up on these breakfasts, learns that bread arrives because people agree to do their part, chooses a life in which agreements matter, and brings that disposition to an office or a classroom. You cannot prove this chain on paper, but you can feel it in cities that function. Civic trust has to start somewhere. Starting each day with a small promise kept is not a cure for history's illnesses, it is a tonic against them. When you finally break the roll, you notice the crumb one last time. Fine, even, quietly aromatic with wheat and milk. You choose whether to spread apricot or to leave it plain. You drink coffee, not to sharpen yourself, but to steady yourself. You are, for a moment, in the same company as people whose names fill registers and as people whose names survive only as initials beside deliveries. The Kipferl has hosted emperors and apprentices with equal competence. That is a good ending, a food that behaves impartially. If you wish to make this roll far from its birthplace, nothing stops you. The necessary things exist wherever people have taught grain to behave. A bowl, a bench, flour that can take direction, a leaven that wakes on schedule, fat that carries the scent of grass or grain, heat that honours time. You may not have imperial porcelain, a Wachau preserve, or a basket that knows palace corridors. You do not need them. Attention is portable. So is patience. You will fail a few times in unremarkable ways and then succeed in unremarkable ways, and the result will be a breakfast that persuades you, gently, that order can be kind. To seal the lesson, you practice forgetting the myths and remembering the systems. You thank silently the miller and the dairyman and the carter and the orchard keeper and the laundress and the steward and the baker and the apprentice, who tucked the point of dough under the roll so it would not open in the heat. You accept that some endings are acknowledgements, not finales. The Kipfel story concludes by leaving you equipped to conduct it yourself. There remains a final reflection, which a sleeping history owes you. How ordinary things shape memory. You will not remember every speech made in a court, or every memorandum, or every audience. But you might remember, in your own life, the feel of a morning that began reliably. You might associate clarity with a small, warm bread. You might repeat that habit for years without giving it a name. The Kipfel teaches you to look for the parts of history that are not made of events but of repetitions. When people say a period felt stable or fell into disorder, they are telling you about breakfasts as much as about borders. Endings of eras can be heard in ovens cooling too early and deliveries that come late. Beginnings can be tasted in the return of a certain crumb. So you put the basket cloth back, you wipe the bench, you leave the kitchen with the modest pride of someone who has completed a necessary cycle. The palace wakes behind you. Far away, someone else is tying an apron and reaching for a bowl in a room you'll never visit. The same movements will happen there with different names attached. If you want to carry something forward, carry this: the knowledge that recipe can mean relationship. When you keep those relationships, the food keeps you. The roll is gone from the plate now, the coffee cup is empty, the porcelain has cooled. Nothing in the room demands applause. The day is ready. You measure this readiness by the steadiness in your hands and the ease with which the next task begins. The Kipfel's ending, then, is not an ending at all. It is a readiness that outlives the meal. In your own mornings, far from palaces, close to your work, what humble, repeatable act could you treat with enough attention that it becomes not only fuel for the day, but a quiet way of keeping faith with yourself and with others? In palace kitchens, vanilla beans split, beet sugar weighed, custard thickens differently, merchants' invoices meet menus, spoons cool on marble, Vienna learning sweetness to schedule. You enter the palace kitchens at the hour when milk is warm but not yet fragrant, when a pan's dull shine promises work rather than performance. You're not here for cake today, you're here for a sauce, which is humbler and more instructive, a custard that will coat the back of a spoon, glaze a bowl of stewed fruit, soften a slice of yeast cake, or fill small porcelain cups lined up like quiet soldiers beside the warming cabinet. In the imperial household, custard is not an event, it is a background, one of those dependable textures against which other flavours speak. But the way this custard is made tells you a great deal about the empire's trade, its agriculture, and its patience. It tells you what changed when vanilla arrived dependably, and when sugar ceased to be a shipborne luxury and became a domestic habit. You begin with the word itself. Custard here is not a single idea. You have thin, pouring custards for sauces, what later French kitchens will canonize as crème anglaise, and thicker stirred creams for pastries, what will be called crème pâtissière. Viennese practice knows both, and also a third, an intermediate spoonable cream that sits between sauce and filling, thickened gently but not stiff, suitable for fruit compotes and simple puddings. The distinction matters because ingredients reflect purpose. Eggs will thicken the sauce if you accept the risk of curdling. Flour or starch will give insurance if you want a margin of safety. You watch the cook weigh preferences in the same way she weighs sugar, with a calm hand accustomed to consequences. Set on the table the things that must agree with each other. Milk, delivered from near estates or city dairies, is brought to a simmer in a heavy pan whose base has learned not to scorch. Sugar stands in a white bowl whose colour is itself a chapter of history. Cane sugar once took a rough, tan and costly path across oceans. Beet sugar, by contrast, grew in soils not far from where you stand. Between the mid-18th and the 19th centuries, people learned first that beet held sugar at all, and then how to coax it out at an industrial scale. Experimental discovery belongs to Andreas Marggraf, 1747. Practical factories to Franz Karl Achard and others at the turn of the 19th century. In Habsburg lands, Bohemia and Moravia will soon be dotted with chimneys whose vapour marks the conversion of beets into crystals. Domestic sugar steadies the pantry. It changes cookery not by a new flavour but by a new certainty. You can sweeten daily without waiting on ships. Vanilla is the other change, and it enters the kitchen by a different door, through apothecaries and spice merchants, through Trieste and the warehouses that translate sea into shelf. The pod you hold is not a seed pod as you imagined when you were first told the word vanilla. It is a cured orchid fruit, dark, slightly oily, with a pliancy that suggests months of attentive labour in another climate. For centuries, true vanilla came almost entirely from Mexico, where bees of the Melipona kind and practised hands understood the flower's narrow window. In Europe, the pod was at first rare and expensive, a curiosity sometimes used to scent chocolate or sugar rather than to dominate a dish. Apothecaries stocked it as much for perfume and supposed health as for cookery. You can mark its European naturalization by the shift from calling it vanilla as an exotic to burying it in a jar of sugar and forgetting it until needed. Forgetting, in this case, signals possession. Spice merchants in the imperial city have learned a stable choreography. Bales and crates arrive in Trieste, the imperial port whose fortunes depend on winds, tariffs, and the quiet skill of men who read both. From there, goods travel north by road and later by rail. In a ledger you imagine leafing through, you find vanilla listed among cinnamon, mace, nutmeg, pepper and coffee, the costly colony of fragrances in a city built on stone and order. Vanilla sits awkwardly in this group at first. It is less pungent, more floral, closer to memory than to heat. But it binds milk and egg the way friendship binds a conversation. It gives it a tone. In the kitchen today, the tone will be calm. The cook splits the pod with a small knife that sees more string than meat. She scrapes out the tiny seeds and adds them to the milk, then drops the scraped pod in as, well, because waste is a vice even in palaces, and because the pod carries a great deal of scent. The milk will be scalded and then left to sit, allowing flavour to move from plant to liquid without drama. You smell the change long before you see it, a sweetness that is not sugar, a warmth that is not heat. If true pods are scarce, the kitchen knows a thrift. Vanilla sugar, prepared over weeks by burying a spent pod in a jar and letting its perfume work. Later in the century, chemistry will isolate vanillin and make imitation more accessible. But this room still knows vanilla as agriculture and labour, not as a molecule detached from its story. Now to sweeten. The measuring here is simple in principle and careful in practice. Too little sugar, and you miss the soft rounding that makes custard kind to the tongue. Too much, and you stress the eggs, which thicken differently in sweeter environments. Beet sugar increasingly has the advantage of consistency. Its crystal size and dryness can be expected, more of a message than a surprise, as a steward might say if a steward allowed himself metaphor. You watch a spoon sink into the bowl and produce a measured drift that dissolves without complaint. The cook does not taste yet. She waits for the eggs. Eggs are the custard's spine, and the court's supply is not haphazard. The poultry yard supplying the household understand that the kitchen requires not only number, but condition. Stale eggs separate more easily. Fresh eggs aerate differently. The cook today wants yolks for richness and lightness without the foam that whites would add. She cracks with a practiced joint movement, thumbs and knuckles, bowl and shell, and the yolks settle in a smaller pot. A wire whisk, not yet the ballooned tool you know from modern drawers but a practical bundle of loops, breaks the yolks and takes in sugar spoon by spoon until the mixture thickens to a pale ribbon. This ribbon is not art, it is insurance. The sugar begins dissolving in the yolk rather than shocking it later, and the viscous mixture will accept hot milk more politely. You stand at the corner of the table and notice the choice that divides kitchens, whether to thicken with egg alone or to add a spoon of flour or starch. The court's answer depends on who will eat, what the day's interruptions are, and how many hands are available to mind the pot. Egg-only custards are delicate and ask for attention. A few moments of neglect and you have sweet scrambled eggs. Flour or wheat starch disrupts the egg protein's tendency to seize, adding a cushion. In Central Europe of the 19th century, potato starch becomes common, sold as sterkamel, and gives a clean sheen and a gentle gel that hold without heaviness. The cook today, mindful that trays must travel and that a visiting cousin's audience may delay the eating, chooses a small measure of starch. She sifts it into the yolk mixture so it will disperse without lumps. This is not betrayal of elegance. It is housecraft. Milk returns to the table with a line of steam that marks its history. The vanilla has had time to speak. A ladle of hot milk meets the yolk mixture while the whisk moves quickly. This is the bridge you build to prevent curdling. Ladle by ladle, you temper the eggs until the bowl is warm to the hand, then you return all to the pan. The flame is low. The wooden spoon is ready for the old test of nappage, the way a thickened custard coats the back of the spoon and allows a traced line to hold. The cook stirs in steady figures of 8, scraping the corners where liquid likes to collect heat and scorch. She does not rely on a clock. She relies on the way the mixture pushes back against the spoon, the way bubbles threaten and are dispersed, the way scent blooms, sharper now that egg and milk have agreed. You think about how often this has happened. Thousands of mornings and afternoons, in palaces and townhouses, the same motions have convinced eggs to hold liquid. The lost recipe here is again a context, not a list. What was rare decades earlier, vanilla's scent, has become expectable in this kitchen, because merchants have learned to deliver it, and because cuisine has learned to want it. Beet sugar, made cheap by nearby factories and fuel, allows the kitchen to sweeten a custard without apology. Together, The two changes move custard from occasional treat to habitual accompaniment. A bowl of stewed apricots in January, sweetened by last summer's estate sugar and warmed by vanilla-scented cream, is not a feast, it is a rightness. If you look outward from the pan, you can see how trade routes become habits at the table. Trieste's port activity translates into pods in jars. Bohemian fields translate into white bowls of crystals. The distance between a warehouse ledger and a spoon is shorter than you think. When people speak of civilization in the 19th century, they often mean railways and cabinets and theatres. They also mean sauce, consistency, predictability, smoothness, made possible by regular supply. Vanilla's soft insistence teaches palates to expect a certain clarity of flavour, and sugar's steadiness encourages cooks to adjust sweetness, not as a gesture of wealth, but as a calibration of comfort. Because you are listening for ordinary detail, you notice the small tools around the pan. A fine strainer waits in case the custard must be poured smooth for a more formal service. A jug warmed with hot water sits ready so that the sauce will not cool too quickly. A stack of shallow cups has been scalded and wiped to receive their share without chilling it on contact. A cloth is folded under the pan to keep it from sliding on the table while stirring. None of this will be seen by diners. All of it will be tasted as absence, an absence of lumps, shocks, and delays. Vanilla custard tastes simple. It is built on a discipline of many small preventions. You might ask, how strong is the vanilla? The answer is, by court taste, restrained. A single pod may scent a quart of milk depending on its quality and freshness. A pod already buried in sugar may be asked to work twice. Vanilla here is not a loud signature, but a margin. It makes room for the thing it accompanies. A yeast cake's butter rises under it. A stewed pear keeps its own voice. When imitation vanillin becomes common later, some kitchens will use more because it is cheaper and clearer. This room in your present moment still values the plant's range. Floral, woody, slightly winey, with the tiny specks in the sauce proving provenance to the eye, long before chemists offer arguments. You turn to the people who have trained this preference. Cooks do not invent taste, they curate it from what commerce and agriculture permit. The imperial family travels, meets other courts, and brings back preferences that the household interprets. French techniques for stirring and straining find their way into German language manuscripts. Local habits, adding a little starch, pairing sauce with compote instead of with pastry, persist. You hear in the quiet of the kitchen a multilingual conversation about thickness, sweetness, and scent, and you realise the custard is a compromise that satisfies many tongues without announcing any. Sugar lives on other shelves too. The pantry keeps lumps sugar for formal tables, loaf sugar to be nipped, crushed, and sieved, and, increasingly, granulated sugar that pours. The difference in handling teaches hands what economy is. Lump sugar is served in tongs for tea, granulated sugar scoops into batter. Beet factories send invoices on paper that looks the same as any other bill, but their regularity writes new habits into breakfast, dessert, and preservation. Vanilla custard without sufficient sugar tastes hollow. Custard with domestic sugar tastes secure. There are days when eggs falter, hot afternoons when curdling threatens early, winter mornings when the sauce seems slow to answer. The kitchen knows adjustments. A cook stirs over a bain-marie instead of direct flame, exchanging speed for protection. Another will thicken with 2 yolks more and 1 spoon of starch less. The custard's destination matters. If it will be poured warm over a steamed pudding, you want it looser. If it must sit in cups, you prefer body. Vanilla is the constant across these variations, a unifying note that lets small changes read as family rather than as confusion. It is easy to romanticize scent, to speak as though vanilla's role were to make a kitchen poetic. The room's labour corrects you. Vanilla must be stored carefully because its perfume is perishable. Sugar must be kept dry because it lives to attract damp. Eggs must be fresh enough to be safe and old enough to behave. Milk must be heated and watched. Trade opened the way for these problems to exist daily. Discipline solved them. Imperial custard is not a story about decadence. It is a story about managing, abundance without waste. You will serve this sauce with something modest. In summer you might pour it around buchteln, sweet yeast rolls that have been baked close enough to kiss and filled with plum jam, or over stewed gooseberries whose tartness asks for a cushion. In winter, you might pour it over a slice of Gugelhupf, or fill small baked custard cups set in a pan of water and taken just to the tremble. The vanilla does what it was meant to do, connect things without crowding them. The beet sugar does what it was meant to do, make such connection ordinary rather than festive. You pause at the edge of the table and think about what changed when domestic sugar met dependable spice. The court's palate shifted in ways too subtle for proclamations. Sweetness moved from emblem to background. Fragrant sauces ceased to be decorations and became frameworks. Dishes that once awaited occasions learned to report for daily duty, and in a place where order is the language of governance, the kitchen learned to speak order with a ladle. The pan comes off the heat. The custard coats the spoon. The line you draw with a finger stays. The cook strains, not because she has failed, but because she honours the eater with smoothness. In the bottom of the strainer, 1 or 2 tiny flecks of cooked egg remind you that vigilance has limits, and that tools exist to guard dignity. The scrape of wood on metal is brief and honest. Cups fill. A sheet of paper, not modern film, may be laid on top to prevent a skin, or the skin may be allowed, because some diners prefer that tender membrane. Preferences are recorded and formally and silently accommodated the next time. Vanilla remains the same in both cases. It is the room signature. You lift one warm cup and smell it again. Sugar has done its work of rounding. Eggs have done their work of holding. Vanilla has done its work of binding. You think about how far the scent has travelled and how close the sweetness has become. You think about ledgers in Trieste, factories in Bohemia, dairies at dawn, merchants who learned to wrap pods in oiled paper and store them away from light, stewards who learned to count not only coins but flavours. History is often taught by revolutions. Here it is taught by sauces. When did vanilla stop being news and start being home? Was it the day the first jar of vanilla sugar sat forgotten on a shelf? Or the morning a cook reached for beet sugar without checking the balance? Or the evening a guest failed to remark on the fragrance because it had quietly become the taste of how things should be? You step from the warm pan to the cooler rooms where decisions become habits. Section 1 showed you ingredients turning into a sauce. Now you watch how a palace keeps that sauce the same across shifting decades. How a flavour from faraway orchids and a sweetness from nearby fields pass through ledgers, guilds, and storerooms to arrive at a spoon with no drama. Custard is not only a recipe, it is an arrangement. Begin with the lists. The household office holds menus that look plain to modern eyes. Breakfast entries, collation trays, dessert courses after boiled meats and roasts. You scan a week and notice a pattern. Stewed fruit appears often. A slice of yeast cake appears occasionally. Baked puddings appear on chill days when coal usage is already high. And beside many of these, a short note, vanilla cream, or sauce. The word is small, its regularity is large. A sauce that used to be exceptional has become the default companion, and that change did not happen in the pan alone. It happened in supply. In a city where the Habsburg sits like a stone conscience, vanilla moved from curiosity to fixture along the same routes that brought coffee, pepper and indigo, through Trieste's warehouses, along roads improved by imperial engineers, on carts that learned the rhythm of stations and customs posts, later on rails that shortened distance until distance felt tame. But vanilla had a special fragility. You're shown the spice cupboard, a cabinet within a room, within a corridor no guest sees. The pods live in glass and tin, away from light, wrapped in oiled paper that keeps perfume from waking too soon. Keys hang on a ring beside an inventory that records not only counts but conditions. Pods, pliant, sugar dry, cinnamon sticks whole, mace sound. The wording is practical, and so is the discipline. A fragrance that evaporates into the air is a waste you cannot invoice. Sugar lives nearby in a more public way. Since the early 19th century, the empire's beet fields and factories turned a crop with no romance into crystals with enormous consequence. You can picture the factories in Bohemia and Moravia as the winter engines of sweetness. Beets heaped in piles, sliced, leached with hot water, the liquid purified and boiled until a crystallization like orderly frost begins to climb the sides of copper pans. The story matters to the kitchen not because cooks study chemistry, but because regular production sends regular invoices, and regular invoices allow the steward to stock a pantry without gambling. Beet sugar did not make the custard better by taste alone. It made it possible to be ordinary, and ordinary is the highest compliment a court pays a daily dish. You want to know who turns sacks and crates into cups and ladles. The Confectioners' Guild and the kitchen cookbooks meet in a person, a senior pastry cook who can read numbers and fire. In Vienna, the 19th century produced a literature of cookery that looks almost bureaucratic in its clarity. Names enter your head not for their celebrity but for their reliability. Household books by Anna Dorn and later Katharina Prato. Practical collections that fold French terms into German kitchens and teach a generation how to thicken, strain and season without fuss. You do not need a precise page to grasp the culture. Egg-thickened sauces are stirred till they coat a spoon. Starch-thickened creams are brought to the boil once, and both are flavoured with vanilla as available. Availability is the hinge, and beet sugar and trade turned availability from hope into plan. You stand now at the work table where vanilla becomes more than a word. The pod is slit, the seeds are scraped, the spent pod goes into the milk, and the milk goes briefly to a simmer that is immediately tamed. There is nothing theatrical in the movement. You listen instead to cautions that have hardened into rules. Do not boil the milk with the egg in it. The curd will write your failure into the pan. Do not add sugar late. It shocks the yolk. Do not trust clocks alone. They cannot hear thickening. Use a wooden spoon for contact with the pot's corners. Reserve a wire whisk for the tempering. If you must hold the finished sauce before service, keep it barely warm and cover it against skin unless a guest prefers skin. The record of preferences lives in a head. Not on paper, but it is as binding as a law. The room teaches you another rule without saying it. Metals matter. Copper pans are excellent for boiling syrups and reducing liquids, but egg and copper require protection. Tinning exists for that reason, and tins must be renewed. A custard cooked low in a well-tinned pan tastes clean. A custard cooked in a pan whose lining has thinned tastes like neglect. You do not need to recite metallurgy to behave well. You need to behave well until it becomes reflex. Even the ladle has a roll, thin enough that it slides without carving lines into the forming cream, thick enough that heat does not travel to a hand too fast. You move back toward the shelves marked sugar, and you learn the practical differences between forms that recipes name as if they were interchangeable. Loaf sugar must be nipped, pounded, and sifted. Its labour is audible in a kitchen. Taps, blows, the steady sieve rub that leaves dust like frost on the cloth. Granulated sugar pours and disappears. It was the future arriving as convenience. For custard, pouring sugar makes steadier work and fewer lumps. For table service, hard lumps bestow ceremony with tongs and bowls. The steward buys both. Beet factories provide both. The cook uses them where each belongs, and the sauce tastes of correct choices no one remarks upon. You spend an hour with eggs, because eggs govern texture more than anything else. The supply chain is alive here too. A palace does not rely on market happenstance. It underwrites flocks. The poultry yards close to the city promise counts per week. The kitchen earns the right to return trays with shells to be ground into lime for other uses. Eggs are stored cool and turned. Fresh eggs anchor meringues and light sponges. Slightly older eggs, still safe, separate like a dream and build custards that thicken obediently. You are shown a trick that travels easily to your own kitchen. Whisk sugar into yolks before any heat appears. The mixture pales and thickens. It greets hot milk as an expected guest rather than a stranger. The ribbon stage is not a performance. It is a quiet insurance policy. Vanilla anchors the sauce by agreeing to be gentle. Its strength is not its volume but its breadth. One pod can perfume a pot. The pod can perfume a jar of sugar afterward. The sugar can perfume a custard months later. You see the cycle and recognise economy. Nothing is wasted until nothing is left. Later in the century, a new economy appears when chemists in Germany isolate vanillin and then synthesize it from coniferin and other sources. The household does not discuss the names. Tiemann and Hamann do not occupy a cook's mind. But it does begin to receive a flavouring that is cheaper, simpler, and more consistent. Some cooks embrace it for baker's creams and large banquets. Others keep pods for sauces where the specs are part of the expected sight. The kitchen now speaks two dialects of vanilla, and guests hear neither debate because both taste like custom. You open a drawer and find thermometers, glass stems with bulbs, that appear late in the story. Sugarwork needed them most, but custards benefit too from knowing when you approach a coagulation that does not curdle. Before thermometers, you learn the language of the spoon and the line drawn on its back. After thermometers, you can add numbers to your sense. The court never abandons sense. Numbers and sense form a duet. A pan that reads the right degree can still curdle if left alone. A cook who knows the right pushback can still benefit from a glance at a column of red. You are allowed both. Civilization is thee and storage is civilization too. The finished custard cannot always be served at once. The warming cabinet becomes a character in this section. A tall piece of furniture with shelves that retain heat softly, a place where sauces breathe without forming a skin too quickly. Porcelain cups are warmed before filling. A jug is scalded. A cloth-wrapped brick that once warmed beds on cold nights sits beneath a tray, sharing its conserved heat. When you think of palace kitchens, do not imagine only noise. Imagine engineering, small arrangements that protect flavour from temperature swings and time. Service teaches you the last leg of the route from factory and port to mouth. Footmen learn not to jolt sauces. A tray that tilts leaves a wave mark around a cup's rim that reads as carelessness. The person who carries learns the small bend of knee that cancels a step's shock. In a corridor, a door opens inward instead of outward to avoid upsetting food. The door was hung that way decades ago by someone who learned a lesson once and made it permanent. The diner tastes none of this. The diner tastes smoothness and calm. The calm is present in pairings. Custard is not only sweet poured over sweet, it is a mediator. You see it laid beside stewed gooseberries that would otherwise startle the mouth with sharpness. You see it settle a baked plum, whose skin carries a slight bitterness from heat. You see it loosen the crumb of a slice of Gugelhupf saved from yesterday. Vanilla encourages these introductions. It does not insist on attention, and that humility is the reason it rules. In an age that admires order, a flavour that makes other flavours coexist becomes a value, not just a taste. You look outward again, past palace windows to shops and private homes, because a court's routines seep into a city's. Coffee houses offer creams and sauces that echo the palace with fewer steps and more public chatter. Confectioners on side streets sell custard-filled buns and tarts, whose shine owes itself to starch-thickened cream stabilised for standing. In cookbooks intended for bourgeois households, vanilla appears more often year by year, sometimes as pod, often as sugar that has lived with a pod, eventually as a bottle that promises a scent by the drop. A sauce that once needed a steward's permission becomes a mother's habit. Beet sugar made that possible by price. Trade made it possible by presence. The custard becomes the way sweetness is attached to fruit and cake without making either loud. Economy touches everything again when shortages or fasting return. On church fast days, milk yields to almond milk or a water cream enriched with flour and oil. On wartime weeks, eggs are rationed and starch rises. On lean years, for the dairy, the sauce is poured thinner and the portion smaller. Vanilla continues to do its moderating work, knitting thinness into acceptability. You're reminded that cuisine is a school of ethics as much as of appetite. It teaches you how to want in season, how to accept constraint without complaint, how to transform less into enough by attention. No one writes this lesson in the margin of a recipe. The lesson is the cup that arrives anyway. Because you promised yourself accuracy and restraint, you ask what the kitchen would never claim. Does vanilla carry health? Apothecaries once suggested it as a tonic or perfume. The court learned to value it for the mind's mood rather than the body's cure. It calms without sedating. It marks events without insisting that they are events. This is not a medical claim. It is an observation of behaviour. Where vanilla custard appears, conversation lowers, spoons slow, and a room gives itself permission to end a course gently. At the edge of accuracy sits etiquette. You hold the spoon with the same consideration you practised with the kipfel. No scraping against porcelain, no tapping against the cup's rim, no impatient blowing that would make the scent run away. The rules are minor and cumulative. Together they make quiet possible. You notice how the court uses food to train time. A sauce that cannot be rushed trains a table that cannot hurry. In a century of rail timetables and bureaucratic schedules, the kitchen's small demands harmonise with the world outside. Finally, you return to the ledger that began this section, and see the long view as numbers. The household buys more sugar this year than last. The cost per pound is lower. The number of pods used per month is steadier. The recorded complaints about grainy sauce or over-strong perfume decline as staff stabilises and knowledge compounds. The closing of Section 2 is not a flourish, but an approach. You are close to a resolution in which vanilla custard at the Habsburg is no longer a novelty to explain, but a definition to accept. It is made the way it is made because trade, factories, tools and teaching have agreed You hold a warm cup, see the specks, smell the fragrance that began in a flower an ocean away and found a household here. And you ask yourself the practical question that opens section 3. When a borrowed luxury becomes a daily anchor, what exactly is gained? And what quietly is lost in the shift from rarity to routine? You arrive at the kitchen's near silence at the end of a long day, when pans have been dried and set upside down like sleeping helmets, and only one small flame remains, a cautious star under a bain-marie. The custard you met as milk and eggs now waits as a finished thing, lidded, warm, obedient. Section 3 is not about how it thickens. It is about how it finishes its work, how a court eats it, remembers it, and carries it forward until memory becomes custom, and custom becomes the taste by which later generations measure rightness. The question you held at the end of section 2 returns. When luxury becomes daily anchor, what is gained and what, quietly, is lost? Begin in the dining room at the subdued end of a formal meal. The orchestra, if present, has thinned to strings. The candles have shortened to cups of light. Conversation has cooled from debate to exchange. Dishes that required knife and blade have passed. Fruit has arrived. Perhaps apricots in their time, stewed with sugar from the estates. Perhaps pears baked softly in a low oven. Perhaps gooseberries whose sour honesty needs companionship. Porcelain bowls already warmed sit in a line, and footmen pour the custard with the confidence of men who have practiced the angle that prevents drips. The spoon that follows is small and round, all elbows smoothed away by etiquette. In that combination, fruit, warm porcelain, steady custard, you feel an empire at its best, supply gathered, craft focused, appetite disciplined. The first thing gained by routine is mercy. Rare things unsettle a table, make diners comment, interrupt the hum that sociability loves. A dependable custard, no surprise in its thickness, no question in its perfume, lets the table proceed. You hear it in the pace of sentences. People resume their stories after a spoonful, not because the food is dull, but because it is familiar in an honourable sense. Familiarity here is not carelessness, it is care fulfilled. In a palace that expects continuity from the morning docket to the evening toast, a source that says, "We know how to do this," well, is a promise kept. The second gain is pedagogy. Children at the court and in the households that imitate it learn sweetness as structure, not as excess. Vanilla does not shout. Beet sugar, regular and modest, softens without crowning itself. The palate grows accustomed to sweetness that supports other flavours rather than trampling them. When these children become adults and make choices, ordering a sauce in a cafe, judging a cook in a household, they reward balance. A culture's desserts teach its politics more than it admits. Restraint elevated, steadiness preferred, surprises tolerated in their place. Custard is training for the tongue that later becomes training for the hand that signs. You're tempted to call this conservative, and in one sense it is. The court prefers what it can rely on, and sources are more reliable than revolutions. But do not confuse discipline with fear. The kitchens have changed often, from balm to compressed yeast, from cane to beet, from pods alone to pods and extracts, from benches lit by tallow to benches with glass thermometers ready in drawers. They have changed as tradition demands, only when the result can be made as good or better, and when the new can be made to behave within the manners of the old. The custard is a case study in such change. Vanilla, once a rarity, is now a rule. Sugar, once a parade, is now a path. The court accepts the new because it can be made to serve the old purpose, order without harshness. What, then, is quietly lost? The first loss is the moment of astonishment. When vanilla first walked into European rooms with the scent of orchids and ships, people would have paused. They would have asked, sniffed, compared metaphors, and decided how to describe the odour to absent friends. That pause, half wonder, half self-instruction, diminishes as habit forms. Scent becomes background, and background is easy to overlook. You do not mourn this, you notice it. A society cannot live daily on astonishment. It will wear itself out. But the ability to be surprised is a virtue, and routine is a solvent. Custard tames occasion into habit. In that success, a little brightness is traded away. The second loss is difficulty itself. Not the difficulty that starves, but the difficulty that sharpens attention. The challenge of sweetening a dish when the sugar chest runs low, of making a Sunday treat when the pod must be coaxed through a second life in a jar of sugar, of stirring more carefully because replacement eggs will not arrive till Monday. Beet factories and steady trade remove such problems, not sorrowfully, but decisively. Kitchens rejoice in supply, only nostalgia mistakes shortage for virtue. Yet in losing difficulty, you also lose certain kinds of gratitude. The cup that arrives tonight asks for thanks, but less urgent thanks than a cup that required small heroics. The court's grace shifts accordingly from we have it to we have kept it well. Now look beyond court, rooms to the city that follows and transforms. Custard leaves the palace by imitation and commerce. Confectioners thicken creams with starch that bears vanilla's scent. Cafes serve puddings whose wobble is a matter of pride. Boarding houses adopt the habit of pouring a spoon of warm sauce over stewed fruit to soften the day's thrift. The taste that began in a spice cupboard spreads along class lines with minor changes in ratio. In a working household, 2 egg yolks and a spoon of potato starch can do what 6 yolks once did. A bottle of extract stands where a pod would have slept. You could lament this dilution. Better to see its dignity. The taste survives because it can be taught to many hands. Democracy of flavour is also a gain. Having traced gains and losses, you sit with individuals again, because history is borne by persons. A senior cook retires after years of guarding the custard's texture. She has trained apprentices to stir past impatience, to pull the pan 1 minute before the boil, to stop listening to clocks when the sauce speaks. On her last night, the household arranges a plain dessert. Fruit, cut simply, and custard that tastes like many years of mornings and afternoons. She takes 1 spoon and smiles briefly, not because the sauce is remarkable, but because it is correct. She measures her life by small correctnesses achieved in sequence. Custard as ending is minor, as mirror it is exact. Across the city another ending writes itself in different letters. A sugar factory ledger closes a season. The foreman counts crystals by the ton. Men load sacks through a door that remembers many winters. Their work is not culinary, it is industrial, yet their rhythm is inside the cup. You cannot taste a beet field, you can taste its regularity. Vanilla is the reverse. You cannot taste the chemist's apparatus. You can taste the plant or the molecule, depending on what bottle the steward chose. The sauce becomes a meeting point of field and lab, orchard and invoice, and the person who eats it unknowingly takes into himself a geography and a set of decisions he did not make. That too is modernity, the closeness of distant things in a spoon. Close the circle at the table where, on some evenings, the custard appears not as sauce but as simple baked cups. The pan of water, its bath, has done its kinder work. The surface quivers. A few specks of vanilla resolve the question of provenance. The etiquette for eating is quiet. Break the surface without scraping the porcelain. Let the steam rise before your next motion. If the kitchen has permitted a skin, lift it like a page. If the kitchen has prevented it, accept the smoothness as a different kind of reading. You think of old apothecaries who sold vanilla for health, and of modern cooks who rest it for mood. The court does not argue theory, it serves calm. Because endings should offer you something portable, the kitchen leaves 3 lessons on the bench, written not in ink but in repeatable acts. Guard your backgrounds. The thing beneath the thing, the sauce beneath the fruit, the habit beneath the day, decides whether an hour is rough or smooth. Backgrounds require as much skill as headlines. Change slowly, keep promises. When adopting a new supply or tool, measure its obedience to the old purpose. If it keeps your promise to the eater more faithfully, keep it. If not, leave it to novelty. Let modesty do work. A flavour that does not shout can govern a room. Vanilla's authority lies in how it permits other voices to speak. There are forms of power that resemble custard. A final scene. Winter twilight at Schönbrunn. The gardens are grey, the glass houses lit like careful lanterns. Inside, the day's last tray goes up. On it, a small pot of custard, 2 warmed cups, stewed apples, a folded napkin bearing initials you do not need to read. The door opens to a room where a conversation has paused, not from tension but from fatigue. The sauce pours and the talk resumes at a gentler pitch. You do not need to ornate this, you may call it ordinary. Ordinary is the point. The empire's self-conception, order, mercy, duty, has a taste. Tonight it tastes like milk, eggs, sugar, and the distant orchid brought near. You leave the kitchen by the same corridor you entered, and as you pass the spice cupboard, you think of the pod that perfumed a jar for a second life. You think of the bottle of extract that may one day replace it. You think of cans of condensed milk in lean years and of almond milk in fasting weeks. The custard endures by allowing itself to be itself in many registers, thinner, thicker, richer, leaner, so long as it keeps its temper and its task. That endurance is a lesson palaces can teach cities and cities can teach homes. You promised a reflection that meets the present. Consider your own table, far from Trieste and Bohemia. You have access, perhaps too much access, to flavourings by the bottle and sweetness by the bag. The temptation is to turn up the volume, more sugar, heavier scent, faster thickening, hotter flame. But the court's old kitchen whispers another way. Sweeten only to round, not to hide. Perfume to connect, not to dominate. Stir as if your attention were an ingredient. If you make a custard, let it be a gentle agreement among parts, not the victory of one over another. In a noisy century, quiet competence is an act of preservation. You end, as you should, with a cup. Put a little custard into something warm. Sit. Spoon. Pause. Breathe. Ask yourself a practical question that courts answered long ago and that you can answer anew. In an age quickened by novelty, which humble flavours will you guard as daily anchors, so that, when the world knocks, your table can still answer with calm? In the blue salon, bouquetons rise under linen. Poppy seeds wait. Vanilla sauce warms porcelain. Chairs hush, and a quiet evening arranges itself around plates. You arrive just before dusk, when the palace changes register. Public hours closing like shutters. Private hours opening like books. The blue salon earns its name honestly. Walls that keep the day's conversations quiet. Upholstery that has learned to tolerate elbows and teacups without fuss. Curtains that remember winter light and summer glare in equal measure. The room is not grand. It is considerate. It prefers evenings to afternoons. In that patience, a certain pastry thrives. You're here for bouqueton, sweet yeast rolls baked so close that their sides kiss, then served in clusters you pull apart with a spoon rather than a knife. They belong to evenings because evening is when patience can be noticed. The dough asks for time, the filling asks for attention, the baking asks for a steady, modest heat that neither hurries nor sulks. Some arrive filled with jam, powidl, the slow-cooked plum preserve of Bohemia that takes hours and very little sugar. Others arrive unfilled and meet poppy seeds and honey at the table. A few carry farmer's cheese sweetened lightly, suitable for those who prefer quiet to sweetness. In the blue salon, you will see all three habits, and you will understand how a court relaxes without loosening its manners. Begin at the bench while there is still light in the pastry room. The dough is ordinary in the honourable sense. Wheat flour that takes direction, warm milk, a plug of yeast that wakes politely, eggs to enrich, butter to soften, salt to make the sweetness honest, and a spoon or two of sugar because evening deserves kindness. The senior cook handles it like an old friend. She warms the bowl with a splash of water so that dough will not greet stone with a shiver. She dissolves yeast in milk that has been taught not to scald. She stirs flour in by hands before she trusts to the wooden spoon. She pauses to listen to texture. When the dough begins to ask for air, she kneads, not with violence but with rhythm. Fold, press, quarter turn, fold, press, quarter turn. Your fingers wake to the difference between tacky and sticky, between silk and rubber, between needs and enough. The dough learns your temperature as much as you learn its. Proofing happens twice because patience likes to repeat itself. First, the mass rises under a cloth that smells faintly of sun and soap. Then the risen dough, punched down gently, is divided to the ounce and left to rest again. Between these risings, the kitchen prepares fillings. On one side of the table, a copper pan holds powidl. Plums that were once tart are now patient, their water driven off slowly until the spoon can stand, and the scent has deepened past fruit into something almost smoky. No sharpness remains, only a slow, concentrated plum that smiles at winter. On another side, poppy seeds wait, blue-black, rinsed and dried, ground in a mill that keeps the oils cool and fresh, then warmed with a little milk, honey, and lemon zest until they taste like landscape and lullaby. At the far end, cheese is beaten with an egg yolk, a pinch of sugar, and a handful of chopped raisins swollen in warm water. These are not showy fillings. They are friendly ones. You shape the buns with a motion that will live in your wrists after you leave the room. A square of dough rests in your palm. A spoon of filling sits in its centre. Your fingers draw the corners in and pinch a seam that must hold. The bun flips seam down on the board where melted butter waits like good advice. The pan, high-sided, heavy, already warmed a little to greet what it will hold, receives each bun with a trace of butter to keep the sides tender where they will touch. They are placed close, not because the kitchen lacks dishes, but because proximity is the point. Alone, a bun is a roll. Together they become buchteln, edges soft, top slightly browned, interiors that steam faintly when the spoon goes in later. The space between them is where evening lives. You think about where these buns came from before they married the blue salon. Their geography is not imperial pomp, but imperial housekeeping. Bohemia and Moravia send powidl and poppy. Austrian dairies send butter and milk. Vienna's flour merchants send sacks that read like weather reports from the countryside. The rolls themselves travel through households far from palaces, parish kitchens, winter gatherings, inns on roads that like to curl through hills, grandmother tables where children learn that patience comes with a crust. A court absorbs such habits and dresses them slightly. Porcelain where earthenware would do, a warming cabinet where a towel would suffice, a ladle of vanilla sauce if the evening leans festive. But the bones of the dish stay provincial in the best sense, useful, generous, calm. When the buns rise in the pan, they put their shoulders together like choristers. The oven has been trained since morning. After bread and before sugar work, its stones carry a memory of heat that suits enriched dough. The cook checks by palm at the door rather than by numbers alone. Numbers help, but palms tell the truth. The pan goes in. Time begins. A brush dipped in butter waits nearby for the halfway turn. There is little to do, and much to notice. How the tops accept colour, how the sides expand toward one another, how a thin, sweetish smell replaces the raw scent of flour and yeast. In a palace where much is recorded, this part is not. People simply learn to smell done. While the heat works, staff sets the blue salon the way evening expects it. Low lamps, not bright. Cups that want tea rather than coffee. A jug kept warm under cloth for anyone who prefers vanilla sauce. A bowl for poppy seeds. A dish of sugar. Small plates that curve slightly to catch crumbs. The furniture supports the ritual without announcing it. On the sideboard, a platter with a raised rim waits for the pan's inverted contents, if the cook decides to turn the buchteln out whole. More often, however, the pan goes straight to the room on a wooden board, and the buns are served as they were baked, side by side, joined, separable with a spoon. The tool matters. A spoon breaks tender things kindly. You sit and watch the room receive the pan. It's not a parade. The door opens. The air changes a little, the kind of change people describe as comfort rather than fragrance. The top crust shows small flavours of brown that do not promise crunch so much as a modest resistance. A footman offers the first spoonful to the person whose day deserves finishing first. The spoon slides between buns where the butter kept a narrow seam. Steam rises in a quiet ribbon. The roll yields. The filling shows. A dark purple so deep it is almost black, or poppy like night sky, or cheese the colour of mildness. A second spoon follows for the person who prefers the centre, the bun that has known heat on all sides and kindness from every neighbour. The toppings begin their domestic conversation. If powidl is inside, vanilla sauce often stays in the jug. If poppy seeds are inside, honey and sauce shake hands. If cheese is inside, a dusting of powdered sugar looks like weather. People have preferences, and these preferences can be tracked without notebooks. The gentleman who asks for the edge piece because he likes a shade more colour. The aunt who prefers the centre because softness helps her jaw. The child who negotiates a half and half. 1 spoon of powidl bun, 1 spoon of poppy bun, because children are empiricists when faced with repetition. No one performs gratitude, they practice it. Evening food trains this difference. You spend a minute with the poppy itself because it carries a reputation, a seed that suggests sleep and fields, and to those who wish for moral drama at the table, danger. In the kitchen, it means something simpler. Fat, fragrance, and nutrition, taught to behave like comfort. Ground poppy releases oil that tastes like a neighbour to nuts, and a cousin to warm bread. Lemon peel interrupts any heaviness. Honey binds. A spoonful slipped into a split, unfilled bun makes a different bouquetel at the table in seconds, a reminder that kitchens respect both plan and improvisation. In the court's portfolio of flavours, Poppy anchors winter evenings where fruit is memory and dairy must stretch. You taste agriculture arranged for mercy. Then there is Pawiddle, whose patience earns a place beside books and lamps. To make it, plums are cooked not in a sprint but in a walk. Hours of low heat, sometimes days, stirring when needed, adding little or no sugar because concentration is sweetness enough. Pawiddle is one of those preserves that turn labour into calm. It holds its place in Buchteln without spilling, with a depth that keeps conversation from drifting into sugar. When the spoon finds a seam and opens a roll, the preserve looks back and does not rush. If the Blue Salon had a flavour, it would be whatever lies under this plum, something steady, smoky, patient. You're tempted to call this a simple dessert, but the room teaches you that simplicity here is a method, not an absence. The tray that carries the pan has been warmed so that the buns do not surrender heat too quickly. The spoon is silver not for show, but because its thinness lifts without tearing. The napkins are folded to catch a corner of sauce before it marks a cuff. The side table sits at a height that spares the back of the person who serves. These minor contrivances prevent friction and leave the evening small and smooth. You begin to understand the court's quiet ethos. Remove trouble early. Remove noise before it starts. Teach objects to be kind. Conversation in the Blue Salon adapts to what the pan suggests. Buchteln invite topics that can be interrupted and resumed. News of a cousin's small convalescence. A steward's anecdote about an apricot orchard's yield. The cautious gossip that lives in high houses between errands and affection. The pastry shapes behaviour, with fingers kept clean because spoons intervene, with plates small enough to be balanced in a lap, with sweetness that calls for tea rather than wine. You notice how desserts carry social grammar. Laminated pastries require flakes and fuss and napkins and attention. Buchteln require warmth, the sharing of space, the acceptance that edges and centres must be negotiated in company. Because accuracy belongs in even the softest story, you look briefly at the guild and the market that put these rolls here. Bakers hold the right to sell enriched doughs. Confectioners share borders with them where fillings begin. Grocers sell poppy and sugar. Orchardists deliver plums that will become Pawiddle long before frost. The palace buys from people it can scold if deliveries fail, and praise by silence when they do not. Prices are negotiated, not flaunted. On years when plums ripen poorly, the kitchen shifts toward poppy and cheese. On years when poppy harvests are lean, Pawiddle carries more of the winter's work. The Blue Salon is not a country apart. It is a mirror angled toward supply. The buns come out of the oven and accept a final kindness. A brush of butter across the tops, thin enough not to glisten, thick enough to keep the surface from drying while they travel. A few grains of vanilla sugar may be flicked across for anyone who enjoys the scent rising one more time from a crust. The pan rests 2 minutes so that steam arranges itself inside. The first spoonful would be wet otherwise. Restraint predicts pleasure better than impatience does. The cook waits with hands composed, hearing instead of seeing when the moment arrives. The muffled sound of crust responding to air, the weight in the pan easing, the scent rounding. Then the door and the room and the tray and the spoon, and the evening begins in earnest. You take your portion because you are permitted to be both observer and eater here. The spoon breaks politely. The seam reveals itself. The filling offers its slow message. The roll's crumb is fine but not precious. It knows, butter without boasting about it. You taste the habit of the house, sweetness kept a point below loud, fat present but trimmed to carry rather than command, heat moderated to comfort. The first bite is temperature as much as flavour, and temperature is the overlooked art of evening pastry. Too hot, and tongues retreat. Too cool, and buns sulk. The Blue Salon's version arrives at the interval where talk can continue and memory can store. Not everyone eats the same way, and that is a feature. The elder relative, who was once stern about economy, lays her spoon down after one bun and says she wants only the smell now. The secretary, who knows numbers better than seasons, takes a second unfilled roll and covers it with vanilla sauce with the relief of a man who has done adding for the day. The child who finished lessons asks for a poppy spoon over a Pawiddle bun and is indulged, because this is how taste is taught, by permission, not argument. The room bends to people rather than people bending to a menu. You learn that this is what courtly comfort means at its best. Rules serve ease, not the other way around. By the time the pan shows its corners, the room has lowered its shoulders. The person who keeps the kettle checks it with a tilt rather than a peek. Someone remarks that the orchard farther north planted a new row of late plums. Someone else replies that the poppy field along the road to the spa town looked neat last week. The conversation is not deep, and that is praise. Evening pastry rescues a day from consequence. It is the palace's way of saying that not every hour must prove itself. Before you leave, the kitchen offers one more small lesson that belongs to the lost recipe this series keeps finding. You could write down the proportions of dough, and the method for powdle, and the ratio for poppy filling, and the oven's heat, and you would still be missing the part that makes the Blue Salon's Buchteln the Blue Salon's Buchteln. That part is choreography. How close the buns are placed so they touch, but do not suffocate. How warm the room is when they rise, how wet the brush is when it meets the crust, how far the spoon looks for the seam before it commits to a path. These are not secrets. They are relationships. To inherit them, you pay attention more than you copy. You end your plate as the lamps are turned lower one notch, the height that admits bedtime into the building without insisting on it. The pan will go back warm enough that the last two buns can comfort a porter and a maid who will be too busy at dawn for buttered bread. The kitchen will rinse without conversation. The cloth will be hung over a chair back and remembered in the morning. You have learned a pastry and an evening, and you suspect they belong to each other so deeply that neither can be moved without the other noticing. At your own table, far from blue walls and old upholstery, you carry away a pattern, dough that accepts company, filling that rewards patience, heat that favours mercy, serving that prevents fuss, talk that resumes easily after a bite. You could bake Buchteln on a weekday and teach your room to feel like this. You could also fail a few times and discover that failure here tastes like slightly dry bread and reminds you to brush more butter, to let the dough rest longer, to pull the pan 2 minutes sooner. Evening will forgive you. If a room learns its calm from the foods that finish its days, what will your room learn when you bake a pan of rolls that must be shared by the spoon? Will it learn to make space, to wait its turn, to find the seam gently, and will you let it? You move from the warmth of the pan to the arithmetic that allows evenings to behave themselves. Section 1 showed you the dough and the room. Section 2 must show you the structures that make such dough and such rooms ordinary, the quiet agreements between guilds and gardens, storerooms and schedules, people and seasons. Buchteln are not a miracle. They are a choreography of modest competencies repeated until the result tastes inevitable. Begin with grain. The flour that gives Buchteln their even crumb does not appear because someone wished it so. Bakers know the temperament of wheats the way secretaries know the temperament of clerks, who will hold, who will collapse when burdened. The pastry room prefers a moderate strength flour that welcomes butter and egg without sulking, milled fine enough to grant tenderness, but not so fine that the dough loses its conversation with air. Millers in the city send samples folded into paper cones. The cook tears a corner and pinches a little between thumb and forefinger, listening for the whisper of refinement. Contracts follow taste, but they are written in numbers, moisture, ash, expected rise. A roll that proves within the window the kitchen has learned to call evening as a roll the steward will underwrite. Yeast is a schedule disguised as a living thing. The palace kitchen uses compressed yeast increasingly, because evenings dislike surprises. Balm from brewing will still do on days when haste is not a tyrant, but the little bricks wrapped in paper deliver predictability. The dough wakes as if someone had tapped it at the appointed hour. The proofing cupboards absorb this expectation. A shelf warmed by a flue, a door that remembers to close softly, a clerk who notes when the first rise began. These are ingredients seldom listed, yet they season the dough more reliably than spices do. If the day runs long, an audience that overwalks its hour, a carriage delayed, the cook can slow the second rise by moving the pan to a cooler shelf, or hurry it by visiting the warmer corner. The kitchen does not so much command yeast as negotiate with it. Butter comes with the weather folded into it. In summer, the dairy's fat smells faintly of grass and open water. In winter, of hay and the slow patience of stabled animals. The pastry accepts both and registers the season without commentary. The court does not pretend to a flat world. It prefers the truth told politely. Butter is clarified for brushing pans and tops because clarified butter behaves. No popping water, no scorching milk solids, only a thin, persuasive fat that speaks quickly to crust without shouting. The brush itself is a tiny tool of policy. Boar bristles trimmed to a softness that whispers over dough instead of dragging it. A handle that sits in the hand like a well-made pen. If you imagine palaces outfitted only for spectacle, learn to love these small efficiencies. They are how palaces purchase quiet. Preserves remind you that sweetness is a verb. Powerdle demands a harvest well-planned and a fire well-managed. The kitchen writes its year with plums, baskets arriving from Bohemia in late summer, the sorting into bruised and proud, the pitting done by hands that have learned the quick twist that frees stone from flesh, without tearing either. Copper pans meet plums and low heat for hours. A paddle becomes a metronome that sighs against the curve of the pot. The thickening is measured not with clocks but with the way a wooden spoon draws a path that closes slowly, the way bubbles turn from lively to solemn. Sugar is added sparingly or not at all, because concentration is its own sweetness, and because winter is long. The finished preserve sits in stoneware jars sealed with parchment and a wax cap labelled in a pan that wastes no flourishes. Powerdle, year, orchard. The label is important because memory cannot be trusted alone. In January, when the blue salon asks for evening, no one wants to debate whether a jar belongs to last harvest or the one before. Then there is poppy, blue-black seed that tastes like fields sung to sleep. The grocer delivers sacks that need rinsing because dust and seed travel together. The rinsing is not indulgence. It removes the small bitterness that idles in a careless mouth. The seeds are dried on cloths laid across racks, then ground in a dedicated mill that takes oil seriously. Too much friction, and poppy turns sullen. Milk or water loosens the ground seeds, honey persuades them, lemon zest keeps them from brooding. Occasionally a spoon of raisins, plumped in warm water, interrupts the velvet with a polite sweetness. In houses less endowed with fuel, the filling is made at table. Seeds ground in a family mill, honey stirred in a cup, each bun split and dressed one by one. The palace keeps the filling warmer and more collective, but the principle is the same. Poppy is a domestic luxury, a proof that agriculture has learned to comfort. A word for cheese because Topfen, fresh curd, has its own calendar. Milk sours, curdles, drains, yields a clean white mass that is as variable as the cows and the weather. In summer, curd comes quicker and softer. In winter, it offers more body. The kitchen beats it with a yolk, a little sugar, and a few chopped raisins rinsed of their shipping dust. The result sits between sweet and neutral, well suited to people who distrust jam's exuberance and poppy's perfume. Cheese-filled Buchteln a conversation in pastry form, measured, agreeable, easy to join and to leave. You turn from ingredients to institutions. Bakers and confectioners police a border that Buchteln happily straddle. The roll is bread, yeast, flour, salt. Yet the filling and the evening claim it for the sweet kitchen. Guilds resolve jurisdiction by custom. The palace may ask either bench to lead, and the benches coordinate more than they compete. Apprentices cross over, 1 week shaping crescents, another week pitting plums and learning not to stain cuffs. The master's authority is less about genius than about consistency. He can produce the same pan tomorrow and the day after, adjusting for flour thirst, for yeast mood, for the new boy's too earnest brush. Courtly kitchens are bureaucracies of kindness. They improve by small corrections. Storerooms are the empire's second stomach. The pantry holds jars and sacks in rows that would shame a clerk's files. Poppy, new. Poppy, last year for filling. Powerdle, ripe year. Powerdle, lean year. Vanilla sugar, pods spent for scenting crusts. Almonds, Lent. The notations matter because evening has constraints. A fast day shifts butter to oil and filling to poppy without dairy. A meatless Friday can still end kindly if a pan of unfilled rolls meets a jug of vanilla sauce made with almond milk. Lent arrives and the kitchen, obedient, shortens sweetness rather than spirit. The discipline is not austere. It is articulate. A calendar can organise appetite without insulting it. Fuel sets tempo. The oven that takes Buchteln is not the one that takes sugar to thread or pearl. Its heat wants steadiness rather than intensity. Wood teaches you patience, coal offers duration. The fireman is a musician who plays in long notes, adding a split log or a shovelful of coal, not because a recipe demanded it, but because the evening did. He has learned the curve of the oven's day, and the feel of its bricks under palm. He can tell you, without numbers, when the top crust will accept butter and when it will spit it back. If he errs, the room forgives him. If he errs twice, the steward corrects. Competence protects kindness. Service is an ethics. The pan is carried level. The person who carries understands that a tilt is not a scandal, but a discourtesy. Sauce running to one side, poppy smearing a seam, powder shifting its centre. Doors open in the right direction because a century ago a porter hung them, so after he knocked an entire tray sideways and learned the lesson that made future evenings safer. The cloth that sits between pan and board is not decorative. It holds heat and prevents slips. Even the spoon's bowl reveals policy. Round, not pointy, because you do not carve bouquetons, you part them. Food teaches behaviour more gently than rules do. You look outward from the blue salon to the city that learns its manners from such. Rooms. Inns along the post road serve pans of bouqueton to travellers who arrive tired and suspicious. Suspicion is disarmed by familiarity. Parish kitchens close winter gatherings with the same rolls, lined on an enamel pan that remembers dings and pies and generations of Sunday heat. In bourgeois apartments, a mother saves stale bouquetons by splitting them, toasting their faces near a stove, and spooning a little milk and sugar to make them new again. She calls it thrift. The child calls it a second dessert. Recipes travel not on paper, but by mouth and by the wrist that gestures here, fold, here. Because precision belongs to sleepy history, note the small instruments that make repetition easier. A scale with brass weights prevents arguments between hand and eye. A cutter, little more than a length of thread or a taut wire, divides dough cleanly without tearing protein into rags that bake tough. A pan with high, honest sides supports buns that want to lean into each other. A brush, dipped lightly, finds the surface without washing away seams. These are not techniques to impress. They are techniques to prevent apology. Etiquette bends toward mercy as well. The blue salon avoids knives after dusk. It prefers spoons because spoons remove friction. No scraping, no sudden clink, no jagged edge against porcelain. Napkins are linen because linen absorbs without fuss and releases stains to boiled water and patience. Plates are smaller than Daylight's plates, partly to keep the hand comfortable, partly to remind appetite it is evening. Tea pours more often than coffee, not as law but as habit. A day that has spoken strongly takes comfort in a drink that speaks softly. The rolls learn from the room, and the room learns from the rolls until you cannot say which taught which. There are errors, and the system anticipates them. The pan may overproof, rounded caps collapsing into the gap between buns. The remedy is simple. Bake sooner next time, brush a shade earlier, accept that tonight's rolls will be tender, but a touch uneven, and that no one at the table is harmed. The filling may try to escape. The hands learn to pinch more firmly, or to brush the seam with a breath of egg white. The oven may sulk. The fireman coaxes with a small opening of the door to sharpen the drawer. The kitchen writes none of this down. It remembers. Repetition writes character without ink. A word for variation, because empires collect local noon. In Styria, poppy gives way to walnut on some nights, ground and sugared and held together with milk. In Salzburg, apricot jam challenges powidl politely. In Moravia, cheese leans sour and drier, a firmer crumb that stands up to transport. In households marked by Friday abstinence, oil replaces butter and buns tighten their crumb accordingly, and nobody complains because the evening still gathers. The palace does not erase these dialects. It lets them speak when the guest list suggests it, offering a pan that tastes like a map. The arithmetic of cost runs through everything without souring it. Buns are economical because dough dilates generosity. One pan gives 16 civilities for the price of a few eggs and some patient heat. Powidl stretches sweetness across winter, without constant recourse to purchase sugar. Poppy is dense with calories for nights when warmth must be eaten because fuel must be saved. Cheese is the dairy's way of keeping milk beyond its day. These are not poorhouse calculations. They are the mathematics of a room committed to kindness that does not depend on feast days. The blue salon's glamour is a budget behaving itself. You might wonder where the spectacle has gone. It has not been banished. It has been scheduled. Sugar sculptures appear when ambassadors need reminding. Marzipan menageries show on birthdays. But the court's self-respect is more often located in a pan that arrives correct, on time, without incident. Buchteln are a declaration that comfort is a public good within these walls. To keep making that declaration, the kitchen invests not only in ingredients, but in people, training, wages that prevent theft from attracting, resting days that make steady hands possible. A pastry can be a labour policy if you read it correctly. The pan returns to the scullery after the room has dipped its lamps. The residue of butter and syrupy plum is not an annoyance, it is a document. A well-used pan cleans more easily than an idly polished one because fat has taught its surface to forgive. A rag and hot water undo the evening. The brush is rinsed and hung bristles down so gravity will keep it ready. The cloth is boiled tomorrow, not tonight, because fuel is a schedule and because no one will come inspecting linen at midnight. Even the delay is an ingredient in the palace's calm. Before you close this section, look at one small hinge that connects rooms to years. The contented habit of leftovers. 2 Buchteln often remain by design. They go to the porter, who will be on the first hinge of dawn, and to the laundress, who smooths the salon's fabrics into tomorrow. A system that saves comfort only for those at the middle of the day is a system that will fray silently. The palace knows this in its bones. Pastry does not reform empires, but it can prevent certain kinds of pettiness that rot them. You measure a house by the way it treats its last buns. You carry finally a set of rules that are not written as rules because they would sound severe, and this room prefers gentleness. Make the room fit the food and the food fit the room, spare both of them the indignity of strain. Choose tools that remove friction rather than announce skill. Keep a calendar that speaks to appetite without shouting at it. Let thrift arrive dressed as kindness. Trust repetition to teach better than reprimand. The evening prepares to begin again tomorrow, as you finish tracing its mechanics tonight. Flour will be delivered with weather folded into it. Yeast will be pinched from paper like a proof of punctuality. Butter will confess what the cows ate. Plums and poppy will remember fields. Cheese will remember a morning. The blue salon will remember lamps half-turned, cups that prefer tea, voices that learn to land softly. You have seen how ordinary pleasures are farmed, milled, boiled, brushed, carried and shared, until they are no longer a treat but a manner. If the palace has taught its evenings to be merciful by arranging flour, fire and patience into a habit, what happens when one hinge fails, when a delivery misses, when a fire sulks, when a hand is absent? And will the room keep its promise anyway? Or will you hear the pastry stutter and realise how many small fidelities were holding it up all along? You return to the blue salon at the hour when conversation has worn itself smooth, and the lamps make their small halos on porcelain. Section 1 gave you dough and room. Section 2 gave you the arithmetic that keeps both honest. Section 3 must close in the way evening closes, by repeating itself on purpose and letting the repetition be the climax. Buchteln do not end with spectacle. They end with steadiness that leaves the room better than it found it. Begin with a winter night that behaves correctly. The corridor is a ribbon of cool air. The salon holds its own weather, tepid, settled, not eager to prove anything. A pan arrives with buns that touch shoulders but keep their names. The first spoon chooses the seam lightly and releases a puff of steam that smells of butter and flour and something dark from the field. Poppy if that is the knight's choice, or plum if the jars were generous this year. The second spoon does not race it. Etiquette keeps the pace kind. Tea says what tea always says at this hour. Patience first, then comfort. If there is vanilla sauce, it is warm enough to be hospitable and cool enough to keep tongues from retreating. Nothing on the tray asks for applause. Everything asks for permission to do its work. You watch the room settle into the pastry's rhythm. A young clerk with cramped fingers lets them widen around a small plate. An aunt who has saved her appetite for sweetness descends calmly on a centre bun. A child, promised only one, negotiates for a second on the condition that it be shared. The negotiation is itself part of the recipe. Buchteln are designed for division. The spoon parts without tearing, the filling stays where it was placed, and the crumb receives additions. Poppy, honey, a spoon of sauce, without drama. The pastry models social grammar. Ask, share, do not hurry, leave a good edge for the next person. No one says this aloud. The pan says it for them. Because endings should show strain as well as harmony, a small failure intrudes. The second pan, meant for a larger company, has overproved. Caps have erupted slightly into the narrow lanes between buns, then collapsed in the oven into shallow valleys. A younger cook looks stricken, as if the room will notice and rename the evening. The senior cook does what habit allows, brushes a touch more butter over the warm tops, covers the pan with a folded cloth for 3 minutes so steam softens the surfaces, then sends it out confidently. The spoons encounter tenderness instead of sheen. The room encounters generosity instead of perfection. No one is injured. In the kitchen, a simple correction is already filed in the mind for tomorrow. Load sooner, raise the shelf a finger's breadth higher, check the flue. The climax is not the error. It is the refusal to turn an error into an event. Next, an absence. The poppy delivery has been delayed by snow on the northern road. The pantry holds a sack marked last year. Still good, slightly dull. The cook chooses not to pretend. Tonight's buns run heavier on powidl and cheese. On the sideboard sits a small bowl of chopped walnuts warmed with milk and honey, a regional habit borrowed without fanfare from a Styrian aunt. The label on the bowl says nothing. The room tastes and adjusts. Customs survive because they admit cousins. A pastry loyal to one harvest would be a narrow citizen. Buchteln belonged to a confederation of fields. A third interruption, this time gentle rather than stern. It is a fast day. Butter is replaced with oil, cheese with a poppy that did arrive, milk with almond milk perfumed by a spent vanilla pod that has given up its second life in a jar of sugar. The dough tightens, the crumb is cleaner, the crust accepts oil differently, and the room, obedient to calendar as to clock, accepts the change as part of belonging. Modesty wears many uniforms. The pan observes them all without sulking. You learn that a lost recipe often hides not in ingredients, but in the willingness to let rules make food kinder rather than stricter. The service, which you have watched enough to trust, reveals its last kindnesses. The footman who carries the pan has learned to keep his elbows close and his steps shallow. A deep step tilts the tray and rings sauce around a rim. The person who portions has learned to angle the spoon so that the seam opens toward the server rather than toward the plate. This keeps filling in the roll instead of on the cloth. The laundress, whose work is part of the menu whether anyone admits it or not, has learned to fold napkins so the densest corner meets the mouth first, catching the smallest slick of plum or honey before it seeks a cuff. A system that remembers its cloth remembers its people. You would like to close with provenance too, because endings that name their sources keep gratitude within reach. The powidl came from a year that cooperated. Nights cool enough to slow the fruit, days warm enough to deepen it. The poppy came from fields that tolerated a wet spring and liked the dry spell that followed. The flour came from a mill where stones were kept honest by men who listened to their song. The yeast came folded in paper like an appointment kept. The brush came from a shop that trims things to their task. The pan itself is a ledger of former evenings, the patina that honest fat gives honest metal, the corners that clean more quickly now than when they were new. The pastry carries all of this without needing to tell it. You tell it for your own instruction. Because you are closing, you walk the route backward once more, to remind yourself what cannot be written down easily. Hands, how they pinch a seam and know that it will hold. Eyes, how they read dough's surface at the instant before it goes from proof to presumptuous. Ears, how they hear a hush inside an oven, when the crust is just sealed and not yet coloured. Noses, how they tell whether a poppy filling has been ground warm enough to release its oil but not hot enough to taste weary. These are not nostalgias. They are the practical senses that make repetition into a craft. If you want to carry anything away, carry the way the room trusts those senses and pays them with calm. Now you permit yourself a small table of pairings, not to show off but to calibrate. A powidl bun prefers tea that leans toward tannin and away from perfume. The vanilla in the jug should be gentle, pod-scented rather than extract sharp, so the plum keeps its old orchard voice. A poppy bun likes honey that has known fields, not citrus blossoms. The lemon zest in the filling already owns that register. The honey should sit bass to poppy's baritone. A cheese bun wears powdered sugar better than sauce. It also likes a spoon of stewed apple on its plate, because apple repeats dairy's calm without introducing a quarrel. These are not rules. They are apologies prevented. The room will end the evening as it always ends, by making room for people who worked while others rested. 2 buns on purpose remain, and a third if luck was kind. They go outward into the house, to the porter who will be asked a question at an unkind hour, to the laundress who will be first to the boilers, to the fireman who will arrive before dawn to teach bricks to behave, and sometimes to the messenger who must ride before the road forgets last night's snow. The palace knows that charity separated from system becomes theatre. Systemized kindness keeps its voice low and arrives on time. You will want modern use, because a conclusion that refuses the present is only half a lesson. Your kitchen may not have a warming cabinet, a pan that has seen a century, or an orchard that answers to your surname. You have equivalents. A home oven can be trained by repetition. A digital thermometer can learn what your palm already knows. A tray lined with parchment can be its own policy against sticking. A clean brush can make butter economical and persuasive. If powder is beyond your reach, you can cook plums down slowly with no more sugar than patience requires. If poppy is hard to grind, you can buy it already ground and revive it with warm milk and a whisper of honey and lemon. If cheese is different where you live, you can drain yogurt until it agrees to be Topfen. The point is not mimicry. The point is to treat evening pastry as a way to teach a room how to behave. You also have your own blue salon to locate. It may be a table that struggles to stay clear of paper, a couch that has seen too much daylight, a corner that waits for a lamp with a mild shade. A pan of rolls teaches furniture to be considerate. It chooses spoons over knives. It asks for plates that fit the lap. It rewards talk that can be paused and resumed. If your house strains toward urgency, Buchteln instruct it otherwise. You will fail a first pan by baking too long or crowding too little. The second will be better, because the first was not theatre but rehearsal. In time, the seam will feel under your spoon like a path you know by foot. The story wants a modest climax, and the only honest one is this. The room finishes the pan and feels no need to raise its voice. Lamps turn down one notch. Someone remembers the porter. A chair returns to the angle that tells a person it may be taken again tomorrow. The scullery accepts a pan that is easier to wash, because butter has taught it grace. The door closes softly, a learned habit rather than a rule. Even the air has learned discretion, the way baked wheat scent lasts exactly as long as the evening and then releases the night to be itself. From this quiet, allow yourself a final historical perspective. Empires are often judged by wars and decrees, maps redrawn and signatures admired. They are also judged by whether their rooms could end the day without injury. A pastry cannot absolve a state of its faults or erase its failures, but it can reveal whether the people who ran things remembered the small mercies that make human arrangements livable. The held door, the steady tray, the portion kept back for the person on the hinge of dawn. Buchteln are not proof of virtue, they are evidence of attention. In a world bent easily towards spectacle, they guard the slower goods, regularity, thrift, gentleness, that keep households from exhausting themselves. You close the story by naming what remains when the pan is empty. The bench remembers warmth, the brush remembers butter, the ladle remembers the weight of sauce, the pan remembers corners freed by spoons, the room remembers being trusted. You remember a method, combine patience with modest fat, combine thrift with respect, combine supply with calendar, combine service with mercy, and allow a small food to conduct a large hour. And now the question that should travel with you, the way a spoon travels with a cup. If your evenings were taught by a pan of rolls to prefer calm over display, thrift over hurry, and sharing over ownership, what small ritual would you adopt? Weekly, monthly, when the weather asks, to let a room end as kindly as it began. At Trieste's docks, crates of almonds and candied peel are tallied, customs seals pressed. Wagons climb inland, and Vienna's pastry shops breathe. Easier by schedule. You stand at the edge of a city that watches two worlds at once. Behind you, hills folded with stone and scrub. Before you, a harbour that arranges winds into schedules. This is Trieste, the Habsburg eye on the Adriatic, a port that makes inland pastry possible. If Vienna's sweet kitchen has a distant heartbeat, you hear it here, in cordage creaking, in crates landing, in the blunt notes of customs clerks tallying what fragrance and fat must pay before they turn into cakes and candies. Almonds and citrus peel are not domestic to the Danube. They arrive by sea and then by rail, and the quiet success of a city's confectionery sits on those two verbs. Arrive, then travel. Begin with almonds, because they are the plainest ambassadors of distance. The nuts that will later be ground into marzipan or strewn onto Gugelhupf travel from groves that tolerate drought better than Vienna tolerates it. Apulia and Sicily, Catalonia and the islands, the shores where trees learn to hold sun in pale, tight skins. The sacks that leave those groves carry more than weight. They carry the memory of salt air and long afternoons. In Trieste, that memory is translated into paper and coin. On the quay, sacks are swung from holds by men who know how to use their backs for a living, and how to keep almonds from bruising. Because yes, a nut can be bruised, and yes, a careless drop writes itself as bitterness weeks later in a confectioner's bowl. Customs notes are practical. Origin, weight, grade, duty. Almonds are divided by size and by sweetness. Bitter almonds are measured more cautiously, destined for flavour rather than bulk, for the faint, almost medicinal accent that makes marzipan taste like memory rather than candy. The clerk who slides his pen across the page has never eaten marzipan at court, but he has smelled enough sacks to know which harvest will be talked about in kitchens 2 months hence. He writes without adjectives. Numbers suffice. A warehouse near the docks keeps sacks away from damp. Trieste's genius is not to pretend it is something else. It is to refuse to let its climate speak too loudly. Stone walls and air that moves just enough prevent mould from trying the same trick it always tries. Almonds are turned with shovels whose edges have been filed smooth so they do not cut skins. A wrong edge is a future complaint. The men who turn the nuts know this and get paid to keep silence in the sacks. Silence meaning no cracks, no rancid whispers. At the far end of the same warehouse, another set of crates sits taller and more fragrant. Citrus arrives in 2 forms: whole fruit when season and schedule permit, and peel already candied in places where fuel and sugar were cheaper, or knowledge older. When whole fruit comes, it will not live here long. It does not forgive delay. When candied peel comes, orange, citron, lemon, its shine is a record of heat and discipline. Peel cut to consistent width, pith trimmed until it will not argue, blanched and refreshed, then simmered in sugar syrup stepped upward in concentration over days until transparency replaces opacity. The sugar protects. Light finds a path through fruit that once fought it. Those boxes, wrapped in oiled paper and then in wood, are small banks. They can sit weeks and not fail. Between sea and city stands an institution that learns how to speak both languages, the shipping firm that will later be known as Lloyd Austriaco. Men there study insurance and storms with equal seriousness. They sell reliability in an uncertain element, and that reliability is what Viennese kitchens buy without ever seeing their books. When a confectioner orders 10 crates of citron peel, he's ordering not only a product but the habit of a line that keeps dates. He rarely reads the names of captains. He reads the effect of their caution in his pantry. The second verb, travel, belongs to the rails. By the mid-19th century, the Southern Railway has tightened distance, and goods that once took weeks of jolting carts now cover the land in days, measured by timetables pinned inside station offices. Almonds and peel are loaded into wagons that know light and dark by tunnels, not by sky. A conductor signs a form. A station master stamps it. The paper seems dull until you follow its consequences. Marzipan can be promised for a wedding next month, and candied orange can be counted on for the Christmastide cakes without a steward bargaining with weather. The rails made promises possible. Promises make menus. Vienna receives in spells. Wagons are unloaded into wholesalers' houses whose inner courtyards hold cool air as carefully as a pantry holds flour. Sacks are inspected, sampled and forwarded, or held depending on who ordered what and when. The city's Hofzucker Bäcker, court confectioners licensed to sell sweetness under their signs, have relationships that feel almost like family ties to these houses. A master confectioner does not need to haggle every time if he is paid decently and on time for years. The wholesaler protects his reputation by protecting the confectioner's schedule. Invoices are letters of trust as much as they are requests for money. Now descend from the ledger to the bench, where almonds stop being cargo and start being ingredient. The first act is simple and patient. Blanching. A pot of water comes to a boil, almonds are tipped in briefly. Skins loosen and slide off under fingers that work as quickly as practice allows. A good kitchen does not waste the skins. They can scent spirits or feed animals. But the real point is the clean, pale seed that will grind without bitterness. Blanched almonds are laid to dry, not in heaps, but in thin layers. Damp is an enemy in the next step. Grinding happens in languages that change with decades. Mortars and pestles do the oldest work. Almonds are crushed with sugar to keep their oil from turning heavy, a measure as old as almond paste itself. Later, iron or steel, Mills, hand-cranked or belt-driven, take over and bring consistency. The paste smells like mildness and promise. It is not yet marzipan, which requires more sugar, and, in some recipes, a brief cooking that brings it together. But it is the base on which marzipan rests, the almond heard through sugar. There are two traditions under the court's roof, and they listen to each other without surrender. A more northern habit likes marzipan with a higher sugar proportion, firmer, made to hold shapes, fruits, animals, little edifices on holiday tables. A southern habit likes a softer paste, more almond-forward, meant to serve as filling or to meet chocolate as a quiet partner. Viennese practice lives between, adjusting to purpose, firmer for modelling, softer for layering. The confectioner's daily decision reads the calendar and the client. Wedding, harder, tea in the blue salon, gentler. Candied peel lives on a different bench. If it arrives already finished, the work is arrangement. Slicing to uniform strips that look like habits, sugaring lightly so they keep separate in jars, storing in a dark place so colour does not fade to resignation. If peel arrives fresh with fruit, the kitchen earns its pay. The fruit is washed and pared so that pith does not demand attention later. Boilings in plain water teach the peel to set aside its bitterness. Rests between boilings let plant and water negotiate. Then the syrups. A day at a lower density, a day at a higher, each day brief, so the peel drinks but does not drown. A rack lets pieces dry until their surfaces stop being wet and start being tacky. A final roll in sugar gives the nap that keeps pieces from gluing themselves to one another. All these steps convert a fleeting thing, sunlight trapped in cell walls, into a shelf-stable companion. If you plan to put both almonds and peel into the same cake, you understand why Trieste matters. Almonds bring fat and body. Peel brings perfume and light acid. Both bring survival in winter, when fresh fruit is mostly memory and dairy wants saving. A Gugelhupf studded with both reads like a map. A slice shows dots of raisins, Danube, squares of orange, sea, flecks of almond, south, and the honest beige of wheat, plains. Guests cut and chew and talk about other things, but their mouths are performing geography. Because this is a sleeping history, you prefer detail to flourish. Follow one crate of citron peel. It was candied in Messina, where a family keeps kettles that have simmered peel for as long as their grandchildren have known their own names. The crate travelled by coastal boat to Trieste during a month when seas forgot to be generous for 6 days, so it arrived a week late. Lloyd explained the delay with the tone of men trained to apologise without confessing guilt. The documents were annotated. The crate moved to a bonded warehouse, and then quickly into a rail car when the line found a slot. In Vienna, the wholesaler broke the crate and found the inner, wrapping intact. He tested a strip against his own memory of right, bend without breaking, chew without sticking to the teeth, a scent that is peel, not perfume. He cut samples for 2 confectioners, one of whom wanted strips for dipped chocolates, the other cubes for panettone-like breads sold near Christmas. The rest was held back because Easter brings other demands. No recipe was written in that journey, but several were supported. Another path, bitter almonds. They are dearer and fewer. They must be used with respect, both for flavour and for the safety that tradition learned before chemistry could explain. A confectioner knows by practice how few are needed to perfume a whole batch of paste, or how a small quantity of bitter almond oil will stand in for scarcity. Regulations appear and harden. How to import, how to label, how to use, and the court kitchen obeys them not only from law, but from prudence. When a guest tastes a marzipan fruit and smiles, what he admires is not daring. It is the exactness with which a room has learned to handle dangerous pleasures until they are no longer dangerous. Trade leaves marks on language as well as on shelves. Cidro becomes Zidrat, Arancia becomes orange. Invoices carry both spellings in the same hand until habit chooses one. The Southern Railway's timetables enter the speech of apprentices. This citron is on the morning train, we can chop in the afternoon. Trieste becomes not a place of romance but of scheduling. From Trieste, meaning from the world, on time. If you listen to a Viennese confectioner of the later century, you will hear the relief rails bring to his voice when he plans Easter cakes in February, and can trust that peel will keep its promise. There is a moral in the peel itself, which is rescued bitterness. A rind designed to defend a fruit is forced by blanching and by sugars that restrain water to abandon its defence and agree to be sweet. Viennese pastry uses this clarity modestly. A small cube in a slice of cake, a thin strip under a coat of chocolate, a scatter over a custard that already meets vanilla. The peel never leads where court taste is concerned, it supports. You could take this as an aesthetic, a preference for order over display, for the reassuring aftertaste of understanding rather than the first shout of novelty. You could also take it as economy. Expensive things are used in small pieces and made to work in groups. Return briefly to the harbour, because a port is also a school of fragility. Insurance is bought in the same offices as passage. The same wind that brings a cargo early can throw another against a mole and crush it. The men who do this work learn a habit of superstition that reads as caution. They mark saints' days in pencil on calendars pinned to walls with rusted pins. The confectioner far inland does not think about these pins when he strews chopped peel over a pan of batter. He thinks about whether the pieces will sink and whether flooring them will keep them suspended. But the pin and the flour share a sentence. Someone arranges a small thing so that a larger thing can go on. If you step into a shop on a Vienna side street in late autumn, you see almonds and peels translated into goods. Trays of candied orange peels stood beside marzipan fruits whose colours honour the real more than fashion. Florentine biscuits, glue almonds and peel with caramel and chocolate. Dark cakes studded with tiny shining squares promise a slice that will behave well with tea. There is nothing aggressive in these displays. They assume a customer who knows what he wants because he has wanted it before. The shop carries, in its glass and brass, the memory of arrive, then travel. Accuracy asks you to mention spoilage and fraud, because they too shape taste. Some years the peel arrives with too much pith left on it, and kitchens trim at their own expense rather than store disappointment. Some sellers try to stretch supply by sugaring poorly cut strips that weep and stick. Some sacks of almonds hide mould at their hearts. The court stewards answer with inspections, returns, contracts that specify grade and remedy. Reputations grow or shrink by how merchants behave when things go wrong. In later years, chemists will test for adulterated flavours. In earlier years, noses and tongues guard the gate. The result is the same: a kitchen that will not let a bad crate teach a bad habit. A step back gives you a precise picture of what almonds and peel accomplish in a cold land. They are portable sunshine and stored fat. They lend winter kitchens variety without chaos. Their role is not invention, it is continuity. You can quiet a February with a cake that tastes of fields and coasts, without pretending that February is June. The moral is quiet too. Accept help from elsewhere without leaving home. You end the section at a rail platform in the city because endings should bring the distant to the near. A wagon stands with its doors open, a handcart waits, a clerk with a pencil behind his ear reads a bill of lading stamped in Trieste. The paper smells faintly of damp and of whatever the last crate carried. The handcart moves. The alley that leads to the wholesaler's gate knows this sound like a neighbour's footfall. By evening, a confectioner will be blanching almonds and planning the week's marzipan. A junior will be cutting peel into mathematically consistent cubes. A steward will be noting that the Southern Railway has met its schedule. Inland sweetness will have taken its breath from salt air once again without making a fuss. If a city's calm depends on a harbour's habit, on sacks turned, peel wrapped, rails kept honest. What small failure along that corridor would you notice first in the taste of a cake? A bruised almond's bitterness, a peel that sinks, or a delivery that forces substitution? And how would the kitchen repair dignity without making a story of it? You step from the here's wind into the rooms where sea noise is converted into paperwork and from there into pastries. Section 1 traced the voyage. Arrive, then travel. Section 2 must show the apparatus that makes those verbs behave. Firms, tariffs, crates, rails, storerooms, guilds, and the quiet people who keep almonds from going rancid and candied peel from turning sticky before it becomes a line of light in a cake slice. If the harbour is a heartbeat, these rooms are arteries with valves that never sleep. Begin with documents because food follows ink. A ledger at Lloyd Austriaco is written like a catechism of reliability. Ship, master, departure, cargo class, risk premium, expected landfall, noted hazards. The entries for almonds and confectionery goods are unromantic. Dry cargo, delicate to damp, and priced accordingly. Insurance is not ornament here. It is a recipe ingredient. Without it, the cost of one unlucky storm would echo for years as empty shelves in Viennese shops. With it, Risk is dissolved into a fee small enough to hide among sugar invoices. You may never taste insurance, but you are always tasting its effects. Customs is next, the state's hand in every sack. The tariff schedule treats almonds and peel as luxuries, then revises its tone when policymakers discover that steady imports fuel not only sweet tables, but also taxable urban commerce, cafes, pastry shops, holiday markets. Duty differs by origin and by processing. Raw almonds at one rate, shelled at another, candied peel at a third, whole fruit at a fourth. A clerk in blue-black ink notes peel, candied in oiled paper, weight net of crate, a phrasing that keeps arguments short. When rates change, usually a compromise between revenue and appetite, wholesalers adjust orders by season and by nerve. The court stewards read these tables like weather. A dearer year for peel means more domestic apples, more nuts, fewer gleaming cubes in winter loaves, and an extra line of respect in the kitchen for what did arrive. Packing is a science learned by splinters. Almonds hate damp, peel hates heat swings, and both hate sudden knocks. A good crate is a small architecture. Tight-grained wood, slats that breathe but do not admit rain, interior wrapped in parchment or oiled paper, corners cushioned with straw that has been dried long enough to be innocently crisp rather than grass wet. Nails must not protrude. A protruding nail is a future tear, and a tear is a future lawsuit. Men in the warehouse learn to hear when a crate is honest. A dull, composed tone when tapped with a knuckle, not a rattle that suggests space, not a thud that suggests compression and bruised cargo. Their wages buy those sounds into Viennese pastry. Rail timetables are the empire's metronome. The Southern Railway's clerks learn to translate sea unpredictability into land predictability. A ship lands 2 days late. A crate is marked for the next morning's train. A telegraph taps the news inland so that a confectioner will move his marzipan figures to Friday instead of Thursday. This is not drama. It is prevention. Prevention is the soul of sweet commerce. A bakery that promises a Gugelhupf studded with citron for a baptism can keep its promise because a station master believed in the exactness of a stamp, and because a porter pushed a cart 1 more minute after the whistle. Open the Viennese wholesale house and look closely. Courtyards shielded from wind and sun hold air like a pantry holds calm. On one side, sacks of almonds are stacked not too high. Weight at the bottom bruises what accounts will later call shrinkage. On another, wooden boxes labelled Messina Cedro and Syracuse Obosrancia rest on low rails that lift them off stone, keeping the floors cool from waking syrup to sweat. A boy with a broom is not cleaning for show. He is cleaning to keep sugar-loving moths uninterested. A senior clerk walks with a penknife and a parchment twist of paper. He takes samples. 2 almonds here, a strip of peel there, in amounts too small to insult, large enough to tell truth. The house's reputation is in his mouth. Fraud exists. Peel glittering with white crystals may be a boast of skill, or the mask of poor candying that weeps syrup. Almonds may be cut with cheaper kernels or carry the breath of old oil. Remedies are schoolroom plain. Return, refuse, reduce the invoice, end the relationship. The better houses write agreements that include, buried among weights and delivery windows, a promise of behaviour. If a crate from a known family in Messina arrives tired, the wholesaler assumes weather before malice and sends a note that sounds like a physician's. The patient arrived warm. We cooled at once. Send advice. If a new name delivers misery, the relationship ends with the exactness of a door closing. Viennese pastry is built on conversations that favour long friendships over cheap thrills. From wholesale to workshop, you visit a Hofzucker Bäcker whose sign has hung long enough to outlast contests and fashions. On the bench, the geography of Trieste has already been turned into mise en place. Almonds blanched and dried sit under cloth to keep air from encouraging oiliness. Bitter almonds stand aloof in a smaller cup like potent reminders. Candied peel has been cut into fanatical cubes, the knife a mathematics teacher. Sugar waits in 2 personalities, fine for pastes, rough for boiling syrups. Copper pans, tinned and proud, are ready to pull a thread of sugar between thumb and forefinger. All this readiness is the city's answer to distance. Marzipan production divides into 2 habits. One is raw, almonds and sugar ground together until they submit to one body, then bound with a whisk of syrup or egg white, aromatized with the faintest ghost of bitter almond, and worked until the paste is smooth enough to forget its particles. This version tastes like the orchard. The other is cooked, a sugar syrup taken to a softball stage, almonds stirred in, the heat's brief kiss tightening the paste toward firmness and longevity. This version holds shapes like memory holds faces, which to make is not a mystery, but a reading of calendar and client. For modelling a menagerie for Christmas, the cooked paste is discreetly sovereign. For a layer in a tort that must slice clean under a knife, the raw paste, softer, obedient. Candied peel has its own discipline once it enters the shop. Even perfect peel can be wrong if it is cut carelessly, measured badly or mismatched to batter. A heavy hand will send the jewels to the pan's bottom. Flouring the pieces is the old, dull solution. Learning the exact viscosity of batter is the better one. The master tests by the fall of batter from a spoon, and by the time it takes a sketched line to close over itself. He wants a batter that can cradle peel like a parent does a child. Support without smothering, grip without clutch. Cubes are folded in with the same restraint that governs gossip in respectable rooms. Recipe books are the paper counterpart of these wrists. German language collections in the 19th century write almonds and peel into pastry with the plainness of clerks and the persuasive tone of a cook who has tried things twice. A winter Gugelhupf calls for almonds blanched and cut small, citron likewise, a phrase that hides years of docking crates against rails and wind. A Cardinal Schnitter might hide a strip of peel under a cream to give a spoonful a quiet spark. A tea loaf borrows Italian habits in December and German ones in March. The books are pragmatic, not choreographic. The choreography is in the shop. Money, too, keeps time. Almonds are dearer than walnuts, peel dearer than raisins. A slice that shows pale cubes in its crumb signals a household that keeps its books with enough margin to pay for sunlight from the south in winter. Yet the shop knows its city. It sells 2 sizes and 3 price points. It treats peel as an accent rather than an assertion. It keeps a cheaper loaf honest with domestic apples and a handful of nuts, and saves the gleam for occasions. In a city trained to dislike vulgarity, economy wears modesty like a well-chosen coat. Storage is continuous cookery. Almonds must be kept moving, stirred now and then in bins so that the same kernels do not carry the burden of weight for months and develop the sigh of old oil. Peel must be kept dark and cool but not cold. Cold invites condensation when it meets warm air, and condensation is the beginning of stickiness. Jars are half filled, not stuffed. Parchment circles are pressed onto surfaces. Lids are tested without drama. The worst enemies are surprise and haste. The best friends are routine and a boy with a ladder who likes his work. Guilds oversee these behaviours without needing to be present at every bench. They inspect scales. They renew tin linings. They test sugar for chalk. They count apprentices at dawn. Their dry zeal preserves sweet rooms. When a master petitions to hang the court's sign, Verpflichterant, supplier to the Hof, he is asking not only for prestige but for enrolment in a schedule, deliveries on paper and on time, fees that support inspectors, the right to scold a rail agent, the duty to apologise with grace if a batch goes wrong. The title is a contract with order. Almonds and peel, though foreign to the soil, become citizens by passing through these laws. Now look at the calendar, which decides more than sentiment does. Advent favours peel, Easter favours almonds, summer yields fruit that demotes peel to garnish, and promotions come back in autumn, when plums turn to powidl, and the city begins to dream of citrus. January tests storage, March tests patience, September tests foresight when orders must be made for winter while the city is still warm. The harbour's schedule is braided into this. A strike, a storm, a quarantine, words that taste like salt and paper, can thin a winter shelf. The shop answers by leaning on domestic virtues. Poppy where peel would have been, walnut where almond would have cheered a crumb, candied quince in place of orange. Substitution is not a defeat. It is the grammar of a kitchen loyal to steadiness. Because this is a sleepy history, you pause for small, boring facts that decide entire weeks. Bitter almonds, though used sparingly, must be locked in a separate drawer. Apprentices sign them out. Syrup thermometers are kept in padded sleeves. Broken glass near sugar is an expulsion offence. Citrus peel is cut on a board set aside for that purpose, because onion and garlic, kitchen neighbours, carry memories that would yell under sugar. Almond mills are disassembled on Thursdays and boiled in soda water. Rinse poorly and next week's paste will wear the taste of last week's fatigue. None of this is charming. All of it is delicious. Trieste's merchants, too, keep their own routines that ripple inland. A family that candies peel in Messina sends a letter each September announcing the coming season's crop. Skin's good, bitterness moderate, colour vigorous, and includes a small chip of candied rind taped to the page as proof. The wholesaler rubs the chip between finger and thumb, tests tack, smells, files the letter under a ribbon with others. In March, when oranges turn to blossoms and lemons to scent, a different letter arrives. Peels concluded, last crates follow. The city's pastry adapts without complaint. You cannot dice what has not come. The rail yard shows its own discipline when weather misbehaves. On freezing mornings, porters warm crate nails with a bucket of coals so they do not split dry wood. On soaking days, tarpaulins cross wagons like improvised roofs. On crowded weeks, a special wagon is assigned to perishables, and the station master sleeps badly until it is left. At the other end, the city's draymen know which lanes hold water and which can be trusted. They paint their cartwheels with a syrup soap, mixture in winter so that slush slides off instead of freezing into a rim that hammers cargo at every turn. All this to move a flavour a few miles without bruising it. You return to the court kitchen for a reading of how these external habits become internal calm. A maître d'hôtel asks the confectioner for 3 things for a reception: small marzipan fruits to dress the table's edge, a gugelhupf with citron and almond for slicing thin, and little strips of peel dipped half in chocolate as polite hand sweets. The confectioner checks stock with his hand, not his hope. He counts how many fruits he can shape without borrowing from tomorrow's promises, measures how much peel can be spared from the Christmas breads, looks at his apprentices and thinks in hours rather than in wishes. The answer is yes with grace. The answer is only possible because a sea wind kept an appointment on paper months ago. Errors, when they occur, are mended in ways that preserve dignity rather than annotate blame. A batch of marzipan dries too fast in winter air and cracks when shaped. The master softens it with a breath of syrup and moves the apprentice to cutting peel, where his hands will learn patience at a safer task. A box of peel arrives sticky. The wholesaler's boy is sent back with a note written without anger. The shop toasts domestic nuts and makes a loaf that does not pretend to be what it is not. A sack of almonds smells tired. The top is removed and fed to kitchen staff in thrifty biscuits. The remainder is pressed for oil used to season tools. In every case, motion toward usefulness replaces lament. It is a moral the city learns by chewing. What do almonds and peel do to a palate beyond pleasure? They teach proportion. Almonds tell richness without heaviness, if they are ground fine and used with sense. Peel tells brightness without noise if it is cut small and used without greed. Together they train a city to prefer harmony over solo performance. You can hear that preference in the way cafes serve cake beside coffee as a partner, not as a rival, and in the way hosts apologise if a slice shows too many jewels. It is a faux pas to boast with ingredients. In rooms that value conversation, food learns to participate without interruption. Finally, you step once more into a back room that smells of wood and accounting. The wholesaler closes the day by copying numbers into a second book. Redundancy as religion. Shipments due, shipments paid, crates promised to shops that keep their word. He ties the ribbon, straightens the stack, and blows out the lamp. Far away, a shed in Trieste clicks as night cools wood. A crate answers by settling its weight more comfortably on slats that have done this for years. Between them, a rail line that learned to keep time will wake early. And in a bakery where a boy will arrive tomorrow with chapped hands and ink on his fingers from night school, a bench will be cleared for cutting peel into quiet squares that will later appear in a slice you will barely notice because your talk is good.